If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 56, The Malfoy Christmas Dinner. The squeezing pressure of apparition hit harder than Regulus had expected. Orion's magic wrapped around him like a steady shield, and for a split second it felt like being forced through a narrow rubber tube at speed. His organs compressed, the world tightened to a point, and then everything opened up again. When his boots met solid ground, Malfoy Manor was already towering in front of them. The front doors stood open. 2 house elves in immaculate uniforms bowed in greeting, Malfoy crest embroidered at their collars. Champagne, roasted chestnuts, and warm magical spices mingled in the air. Somewhere deeper inside, a string ensemble played low and smooth, exactly the kind of music a pure-blood family would choose when they wanted the night to feel expensive. "Plenty of people here," Orion said, straightening his pitch-black robes. His fingers brushed the family brooch at his chest. "Stay close, talk less and observe everything." Regulus nodded, his eyes flicking to the guest list by the entrance, surnames stitched in gold thread. Lestrange, Caro, Knott, Yaxley, Avery, Traverse, Goyle, Crabbe. Families from the Sacred 28 that leaned toward Voldemort, plus a handful of neutral pureblood representatives who'd clearly come to take the temperature of the room. Inside the main hall, the marble floor had been polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the enchanted reliefs along the columns. The carvings depicted generations of Malfoy heads of house forging contracts with dragons, griffins, and other magical creatures. The edges gleamed with gold leaf. Every piece of furniture was dark walnut, armrests and chair backs worked with elaborate curling patterns. The cushions were silver green velvet, cool and smooth under the fingertips, firm in that precise way that screamed money and discipline. A life-sized silver statue stood in one corner, the first head of House Malfoy captured mid-stride with wand raised. A diamond set into the wand tip drank in the light and scattered it, casting tiny specks across the floor like fallen stars. The hall was already crowded. Robes ran heavy on silver green, deep green, and dark red. Wizards spoke in low voices over champagne glasses, witches drifted past in swaying skirts, laughter appearing now and then like a shimmer. People kept stopping Orion as they moved through. "Mr. Black, it's been a long time." A wizard with a neat mustache raised his glass. It was the current head of House Yaxley. His gaze slid to Regulus. "Regulus." "Yaxley," Orion replied with a curt nod, then turned slightly. "Regulus." "A handsome young man." Yaxley's eyes lingered on him with open approval. Regulus returned a polite nod. "Mr. Yaxley." They went a little farther before a short, broad man approached. "Old Crabbe." The current head of House Crabbe wore a smile that tried to look harmless, but his small eyes were sharp. The kind of man who always made sure he stood behind whoever looked strongest. "Orion." Old Crabbe clasped Orion's hand, not too hard, not too soft, pure blood courtesy done like a practiced ritual. "Crabbe." Orion's tone stayed flat, giving nothing away. He shifted aside, letting Regulus step forward, and lifted his chin. "This is Regulus." Past the crowd, Lucius Malfoy and Narcissus stood at the center of the hall receiving guests. Lucius wore a perfectly tailored silver-green robe, his blonde hair combed into immaculate order. He held a wand set with a sapphire, and the smile on his face was controlled and confident. Everything about him, from the angle of his brows to the lift at the corner of his mouth, carried the current arrogance of a house at its peak. Narcissus stood beside him in white robes, her blonde hair swept into an elegant updo. She looked poised and composed, already carrying herself like the lady of the manor. "Uncle Orion." "Regulus." Narcissus spoke first, her voice soft. Her eyes rested on Regulus for a moment longer than necessary. "Lucius." "Narcissa." Orion clasped Lucius's hand briefly. "How's your father?" "He's resting inside. He'll come out later." Lucius's attention shifted to Regulus. "Regulus." "Mr. Malfoy." Regulus's posture was flawless. Lucius shook his hand with practiced warmth. "Call me Lucius. Narcissa mentions you often, the finest of the Blacks." Lucius's smile deepened. He stepped aside and gestured them in. "Please. The champagne and sweets are ready." On the raised platform to one side, the musicians kept playing. Guests clustered in twos and threes, and every conversation circled the same subjects: changes in the Ministry of Magic, Voldemort's movements, and the quiet bargaining of family interests. Regulus followed Orion to a corner and accepted a glass of champagne from a house elf. His gaze swept the room fast, memorizing faces, expressions, positions. Orion had drilled it into him. A social gathering was an intelligence gathering, and the truth lived in the details. Before long, a ripple of commotion moved through the hall. Abraxas Malfoy appeared on the platform. He was much older than Orion, hair threaded with grey, but his eyes were bright. His silver-green robes were embroidered with intricate patterns, and rumor said the core of his wand came from phoenix feather, powerful and temperamental. The talking beneath the platform softened, then died. Every head turned toward Abraxas. "Thank you all for coming to Malfoy Manor tonight." His voice, magically amplified, filled the hall with calm authority. The wizarding world stands at a turning point. The old order is crumbling, and new power is rising. We pure-blood families hold magic and resources passed down for centuries. We should be the ones leading this transformation. His gaze moved across the crowd as if weighing each person's value. Some say this is an age of turmoil. I say it's an age of opportunity. The strong write the rules. The weak cling to them. We will be the ones who write them. Pure blood glory was not handed to us. Our ancestors paid for it with magic, wisdom, and blood. We have a duty to carry that glory forward, and push it higher than it's ever been. The Ministry of Magic has grown soft. It lets half-bloods and those born from muggles act as they please, staining the purity of our world. But now, a great wizard is leading us, clearing away filth and rebuilding order. If each of us offers our strength, nothing will be able to stop us. It wasn't a raging speech. It didn't need to be. Every line coaxed and guided, tying pure-blood interests to Voldemort's rise in a way that fit what most of the room already wanted to believe. Regulus watched Abraxas call for unity, and felt mostly unimpressed. Abraxas was powerful, and clever enough to keep the Malfoys blazing like the sun. But he was ignoring Voldemort's hunger for control, and the narrow cruelty at the heart of him. Dragonpox striking Abraxas right when the Malfoys were at their strongest made it difficult not to suspect there was more to it than bad luck. An ally who became too powerful and too hard to manage was never what Voldemort wanted. When the speech ended, applause filled the hall. Abraxas gave a small nod and stepped down, immediately surrounded. The room loosened again. People broke apart, regrouped into new circles, and the quiet trading resumed. "Regulus." A familiar voice reached him. Regulus turned and saw Cuthbert's father, the head of House Avery, approaching with Cuthbert at his side. Cuthbert wore dark green robes and looked a bit more restrained than he did at school. When he spotted Regulus, something close to warmth flickered in his eyes. "Mr. Black." Regulus, head of House Avery, smiled, all ease and charm. "Cuthbert's been fortunate to have you looking out for him at school." "Mr. Cuthbert, you're too kind," Regulus replied. "Regulus, see you at school." Cuthbert's tone was stiff on purpose, clearly copying the way adults spoke tonight. Regulus smiled back. "See you at school." They'd barely moved on when a bright, heated voice cut through the crowd. "Regulus." Bellatrix strode toward him in deep red robes, bold and flamboyant, Rodolphus Lestrange at her side. He was tall, severe in expression, but his eyes carried the same sharp fanatic light as hers. They were already engaged, close to marriage, and both among Voldemort's most devoted followers. "Bella, cousin." "Mr. Lestrange." Regulus inclined his head, polite and controlled, giving her none of the enthusiasm she was offering. "Look at the pride of House Black." Bellatrix grabbed his arm, her grip strong enough to pinch, her gaze blazing. She raised her voice just enough to pull a few nearby glances. "He's noticed you. That's the highest honor. House Black should be at the front, always. We should be the ones serving the greatest cause." Chapter 57, Just wait until you're ruined bonus. Regulus looked into Bella's eyes, into that blazing, undisguised fanaticism, and felt absolutely nothing. With someone like her, blood meant nothing. The only thing that held a relationship together was a shared goal and shared profit. And that goal was loyalty to Voldemort. He went along with her words, smooth and agreeable. "You're right, cousin. I'll keep working to improve myself, so I don't disappoint the family or that great man's expectations." It was the perfect amount of approval, not too much, not too little. Exactly what Bella wanted to hear. Sure enough, her smile widened. "I knew you were the sensible one. You're already better than Sirius, that idiot. Once you're a little older, we'll serve him together." We'll make everyone understand just how powerful the Blacks and the Lestranges really are. After a few more polite exchanges with Bella and Rodolphus Lestrange, Regulus slipped away at the first opening. He could feel eyes on him from every direction. His performance at Hogwarts, combined with the Black name, already made him a prize worth courting at a gathering like this. Now Voldemort's attention had been added to the list. Some looks held genuine appreciation. Others were measuring and calculating. A few carried quiet hostility. He'd expected all of it. Regulus. Lucius's voice came from behind him. Talk privately. Lucius angled his body and guided him toward the west side terrace off the main hall. Regulus nodded and followed. Narcissa appeared beside Lucius at some point, close enough to feel like she was there as a witness. The wind on the terrace was cool, tugging at the edge of Narcissa's white robes. The garden stretched out below in moonlit silence. Lucius leaned against the railing, lazily turning his goblet between his fingers. He glanced back toward the main hall first, then spoke in that unmistakable Malfoy drawl. The champagne tonight is excellent. A vintage imported from France. Father had someone hunt it down. Regulus stood opposite him and didn't respond, waiting. Lucius didn't care about the silence. He went on. But even the finest things depend on who you give them to. Some people aren't worthy. If they force themselves into places they don't belong, they only ruin what's good. His eyes flicked over Regulus's face. Don't you agree? Things should be used properly, Regulus said evenly. He didn't follow Lucius's bait, but he also didn't slap away the hand being offered. That's exactly it. Lucius gave a soft laugh, still unhurried. Times are unsettled. There are always people desperate for quick results, the type who want to lay out their entire hand just to make sure everyone knows which side they're on. The meaning was obvious. A jab at families like the Lestranges who had thrown themselves in completely, and a quiet probe at where the Blacks truly stood. You understand the situation. That great man's power is growing. Plenty inside the Ministry of Magic have already made their position clear. We pure-blood families have to choose. The Malfoys have already chosen, Regulus replied. He lifted his gaze and continued, calm and precise. Everyone picks their own path. Some people like shortcuts. Others prefer to move carefully. Yes, but choices have depth. Lucius studied him. Something shifted in Regulus's chest. Was this the Malfoy stance, then? It sounded close to Orion's thinking, but words were cheap. This world didn't run on speeches. Still, it was as far as Lucius could safely go. Even he had to survive at Voldemort's side. Regulus looked back toward the main hall. Orion and Abraxas were speaking, and several heads of house had gathered around them. My family's position is being stated, Regulus said. Supporting that great man. Protecting pure-blood honor. Surface words are easy, Lucius said, shaking his head. Regulus looked from Lucius to Narcissa. Narcissa was watching him, calm and intent. He understood. Lucius didn't pull an 11-year-old first year aside to speak like this without a reason, and that reason had Narcissa's fingerprints all over it. Which was fine. This was exactly what Regulus wanted. Regulus suddenly smiled and held out his hand. Lucius blinked, then smiled too, this time with something real behind it. He stepped forward and gripped Regulus's hand firmly, giving it a deliberate shake. You're more mature than I expected, Lucius said, a thread of admiration in his eyes. At 11, having this kind of judgment is rare. You flatter me, Regulus replied, still smiling. But his mind had already drifted. He looked at Lucius, bright and confident, and couldn't help seeing another scene layered over this one, more than 20 years away. Malfoy Manor turned into Voldemort's stronghold. Blood splashed on stone walls. Death Eaters' bodies piled in the hall. Killing done casually, like breathing. Lucius stripped of his wand, kneeling in the dirt before Voldemort, clinging to life for the sake of his family. Everything he had now would not stay his. The world changed fast. The difference between the top of power and the bottom of the abyss was sometimes only one step. Malfoy was a house worth winning over, but not yet. Abraxas was still alive, and the Malfoy voice still belonged to him. When Abraxas died, it would mark a turning point. Not just a transfer of power inside the family, but possibly the moment Voldemort decided to cut away anything he couldn't fully control. Only when Lucius truly held House Malfoy, only when he started to feel Voldemort's grip tighten, would deep cooperation with House Black become possible. What are you thinking about? Lucius had noticed the way Regulus's gaze slipped. Regulus came back to himself and looked to Narcissa. "I was thinking about a wedding gift for my cousin." At that, Narcissa's smile softened. "You're thoughtful," she said. Her fingers lightly touched the corner of her lips, the hint of shy delight there without breaking her poised composure. "But the date isn't that urgent yet. Lucius and I haven't said it so soon." Lucius glanced at her, a gentler smile flashing across his eyes before it vanished. Then his gaze moved between Narcissa and Regulus, and he nodded once at Regulus. "House Black coming tonight honors us." Regulus didn't look at him. He kept his attention on Narcissa, his voice gentler than before. "Of course. You and I have always been close." Lucius's fingers paused against the glass. A moment later, he let out a quiet laugh. Narcissa understood too, and her smile deepened. "Once the invitations are decided, I'll bring yours to the old house myself." Dash. When Regulus returned to the main hall, he'd somehow become the center of it. Cantankerous Nod approached with his son, walking at an unhurried pace. Nod wore a deep black robe, the collar embroidered with fine silver-grey family markings. His eyes were sharp, and authority seemed to cling to him without effort. He was rumored to be the author of the Pure Blood Directory, and his obsession with blood purity ran all the way down to the bone. Young Nod held a quiet hostility toward Regulus, but he didn't dare show it openly. Regulus remembered him. During that Quidditch conflict between houses, this was the one who'd questioned his place. Among all these faces, some came with genuine interest. Some came to flatter for family advantage. Some carried hidden malice. Regulus could feel it clearly when one wizard smiled warmly and shook his hand with gentle strength. The man's magic, however, was laced with venomous intent, almost spilling out of him like poison he couldn't keep capped. A man like that was either stupid, or empty-headed. A truly dangerous wizard could bury every thought and emotion, greet you with a perfect smile, then stab you in the back with a blade you never saw coming. Someone who couldn't even hide his hostility would never become a real threat. Regulus only needed to keep an eye on him, nothing more. Then a sharper burst of malice reached him, obvious and loud, but still harmless. Regulus followed the sensation and found Alger Traverse standing not far away, champagne glass clenched in his hand, face dark with fury as he stared. Regulus met his eyes calmly, and let the slightest hint of challenge show through. The people speaking near Regulus noticed the shift and followed his gaze. They understood at once. The conflict between Traverse and Regulus had become common knowledge in pure blood circles. Head of House Knot gave a light cough, his tone clearly slanted. "Why is the Traverse boy just standing there?" A younger Yaxley snorted. "Probably still hasn't recovered from what happened at Hogwarts." Every gaze snapped toward Alger Traverse, full of amusement and mockery. Alger's face went red in an instant. The hand holding his champagne trembled. He looked ready to explode, but his father caught him and held him back. Head of House Traverse's expression was ugly. He forced a stiff nod in Regulus's direction, then dragged Alger away. Watching Alger's retreating, humiliated back, Regulus found it hard not to be amused. Chapter 58, Christmas Gifts. Christmas morning in Cokeworth came wrapped in fog. The cold clung to the window panes and gathered into tiny beads of water. Inside number 4 on Privet Drive, though, it was warm enough to make your shoulders loosen. It was a typical Muggle home, small, but full of comfort. The sofa covers were faded from too many washes. Unfinished breakfast plates sat on the coffee table, jam still smeared along the edges. In the corner stood a short Christmas tree, wrapped in colorful paper garlands and little lights. Lily sat cross-legged on the carpet, several packages piled in front of her, each wrapped differently. She wore a red sweater, her red hair tied back, her cheeks flushed from the heat. Her fingers were already sliding over one parcel, eager. Petunia sat on the sofa with her knees drawn up, staring at the gifts near Lily like they'd wronged her personally. Her lips were pressed into a thin line. All her life, Petunia had noticed things about Lily that didn't fit. Now it was worse. Her little sister had stepped into a world Petunia could never reach. Their parents sat on the opposite sofa. Lily's mother worked on knitting, Lily's father cradled a cup of hot tea. Both of them kept their attention on their younger daughter. "Slow down, Lily," her mother said with a smile. "Surprises are meant to be savored." Lily made an obedient sound and opened the gift from her parents first. A thick book of fairy tales, and a knitted blue scarf, perfectly suited to her eyes. "Thanks, Mum and Dad." She tipped her face up with a bright grin and looped the scarf around her neck. Then she turned, wanting to show Petunia, only to find her sister looking away, pretending to be fascinated by the view outside. The loneliness in Petunia's eyes was impossible to hide. Lily's smile softened, a quiet helplessness passing through her. She knew Petunia couldn't stop thinking about it, that she couldn't go to the magical world with her. It had changed everything. They couldn't go back to being inseparable the way they'd been as kids. But Lily couldn't fix it. She wasn't the headmaster. So she said nothing and moved on to the other parcels. Most of them were simple, cards and small sweets. By the time she reached the last one, a particularly exquisite package caught her eye. It didn't belong with the others at all. The wrapping paper was dark green, embroidered with intricate patterns and silver thread. Even the feel of it was different. The edges were cut perfectly, the ribbon was real silk, the whole thing practically whispered expensive. Lily's heart sped up. She barely had to think to guess who it was from. Petunia's attention snapped over too, fixed on the parcel with a look that mixed curiosity and jealousy in an ugly knot. Their parents leaned in. Her mother lowered her voice. "Who sent that? It's wrapped beautifully." "It's a classmate from the magic school," Lily said vaguely. There was no name, no tag, no obvious mark, but she knew anyway. It had to be Regulus. Even the wrapping carried that restrained elegance, polite and aristocratic in a way that felt unmistakable. Inside was a small shoulder bag, pale purple, made of soft leather that felt smooth and fine under her fingertips. The style was delicate without being childish, cute in exactly the way a girl would love. A folded note lay beside it. "Wow!" Lily couldn't hold back the gasp. Her voice was pure delight. She lifted the bag and tugged the opening apart, then froze. The space inside was far larger than it should have been. She could easily fit her textbooks and her wand, and it still looked like a small, neat little bag. "What is that?" her father asked, leaning closer, fascinated. "It's tiny. How can it hold so much?" Lily unfolded the note. The handwriting was neat and precise. It explained, simply, that the bag had an undetectable extension charm, meant to make carrying things easier. It even included clear instructions on how to use it. She read it aloud to her parents, making sure they understood how rare it was. "In the magical world, things with space charms like this aren't common," she said. "Especially not made this nicely. Most young witches and wizards can't get something like this." Her parents looked stunned. Her mother reached out and touched the bag lightly, worry threading into her voice. "Isn't it too valuable? Why would that classmate give you something this nice?" Lily held the bag and went quiet for a moment. Regulus's gift was far more expensive than anything she'd imagined, and suddenly the knitted scarf she'd prepared for him felt embarrassingly small. But she could only say, "He's a good friend. I'm keeping it, and I'll help him properly in return." Once something was accepted as a gift, you didn't return it. Not like this. And Lily wasn't the kind of girl who shrank just because someone gave her something costly. She forced herself to straighten her spine and sighed. She thought of what Regulus had told her, that his family was exploring ancient potion formulas. They needed potion materials that could hold a specific magical effect steadily and release it slowly over time. She made a quiet promise to herself. She had to be even more careful, even more thorough. Regulus had his own reasons when he chose the gift, but to him, it hadn't been precious at all. If anything, he'd spent more effort picking the style of the bag than worrying about the price. When Lily's parents saw how determined she was, how genuinely she liked it, they didn't push further. They only reminded her to thank the sender properly. Lily nodded and turned, wanting to share her happiness with Petunia, only to find her sister already standing. Petunia walked back to her room without a word. Lily let out a small sigh and set the bag carefully beside her. At the same time, in an apartment in Paris, Andromeda received a Christmas gift from the House of Black. The apartment was neat and bright, cozy in its layout. Beyond the window, Paris stretched out under holiday decorations hung along the streets. Andromeda sat by the window reading when she heard a faint sound near the door. She looked up to find Kriaker standing there, holding a black velvet box in both hands, his posture respectful. "Miss Andromeda," Kriaker said with a deep bow, offering the box forward. "A Christmas gift sent by the young master." Andromeda set her book aside, surprise flashing across her face before she accepted it. She hadn't been completely struck from the family yet. The blood tie still existed, which was why Creaker could appear in front of her at all. She opened the box. Inside lay a small gold key engraved with the Gringotts emblem, along with a note that listed the details of a vault at Gringotts in Paris. The young master says if nobody asks, do not speak of it, Creaker added. Then he vanished. Unlike the warmth of Cokeworth and the quiet calm of Paris, Christmas at the Potters was loud and full of life. James Potter wore a gaudy Christmas sweater and waved his wand around the living room, performing for an audience. He turned an apple into a little bird that sang, and the room erupted with cheers. Sirius lounged on the sofa, laughing like he hadn't laughed in years, a mug of butterbeer in his hand. He'd fully slipped into the Potter family's life. There were no black rules here, no mother's scolding, only friends and the feeling of freedom in the air. His smile was real. The shadow in his eyes had been chased out by sunlight, and he carried himself with bright, reckless energy. Mr. and Mrs. Potter sat in the best seats, watching the boys roughhouse with nothing but pride on their faces. Sirius threw himself into the happiness, playing right alongside James. And in a small house on Spinner's End, Snape sat at a cold table, opening the only Christmas present he'd received besides Lily's. An owl had delivered it. The packaging was plain, with no mark of who it came from, only 2 slips of paper. Snape's fingers were stiff as he unwrapped it. Inside was a handwritten potion recipe and a piece of parchment describing a basic dark magic spell. Snape's eyes lit up. He gripped both pages tightly. On one of the notes was a single line. Effort is rewarded. Knowledge is built through accumulation. He knew at once. This was payment from Regulus, for passing along information. Snape stared at the words, something strange rising in his chest. He'd offered those messages willingly. In his mind, they'd been of little value, not even worth mentioning. He'd assumed Regulus might not care at all. And yet there it was, a return. Snape had always thought Regulus was like other pure-blood nobles. Proud, cold, and thinks they are above everyone else. He hadn't expected fairness. To Snape, it felt like Regulus had treated him as an equal partner, trading knowledge for what Snape provided, even if Snape himself considered his contribution almost insignificant. He carefully tucked the recipe and parchment away, slipping them into his most treasured potions book. Then he reached for his wand, ready to try the dark magic described. A second later, he paused, as if a thought hit him hard. He set the wand down. The trace. He couldn't practice. The moon hung high by the time the Malfoy gathering finally ended. Orion brought Regulus back to Grimmauld Place by apparition. The moment they stepped inside, Creaker appeared to greet them with a deep bow. Master, young master, supper is prepared. The fireplace in the sitting room was still burning. Creaker had already set the table with steaming cream of mushroom soup, truffle-baked snails, and fresh fruit tarts. Regulus and Orion sat across from each other and each took a spoonful of the thick soup. Warmth spread through Regulus at once, driving the chill out of his body. The food at the party had been refined, but the portions had been laughable. No one left full. Chapter 59, Verdant Magic. Eldrin's verdant magic inheritance didn't come as a neat list of spells. It branded itself straight into Regulus's mind as pathways, patterns, and the method of resonating with nature. Alongside it came Eldrin's own understanding of it, the way a lifetime of trial and error had shaped his instincts. Verdant magic had attributes. It had roots. It had temperament, like something alive. Wind didn't ram straight through obstacles. It slipped around them. Water didn't force itself upward. It followed the grooves and hollows it was given. This magic needed resonance and guidance, not crude taking. Eldrin's talent had been a bridge he'd been born with. He could speak directly with verdant magic. He could see how it flowed, as if it were as visible as torchlight to him, and that sight had been his by nature. Regulus didn't have those eyes. He didn't have that kind of luck. But he could feel a plant's mood and condition, like a second set of senses no one had taught him. It wasn't sight, exactly, but it was something. That was enough. Because Eldrin had left decades of experience behind, every path that worked, every dead end, every hidden snare, every place where treasure waited if you were patient enough to notice. Now Regulus only needed to walk that road in his own way. He thought back to the Daisy experiment. He'd guided the magic in a healthy Daisy to repair a damaged one, and it had worked, but it had been clumsy and slow. Now he understood why. He'd been hauling magic around like water in a bucket, while Eldrin's method was closer to digging a channel and letting the water flow where it wanted to go. Even so, the wizarding world had never had a rule where inheritance meant you could reach the heavens in a single step. If it worked that way, then Grindelwald or Voldemort would have already gathered an army of heirs and swept the earth. Inheritances carried an ancestor's spirit and will. This was one of the Black family's few dozen inheritances across 1,000 years, each one condensed from an entire life's work. There was no way to master it without paying the price in effort. Regulus had to digest it. Break it down. Make Aldrin's understanding his own. Creaker, he called softly, seated at the wooden desk in the attic. Bring a few pots of dittany. The house elf appeared at once, nose nearly brushing the floor, cradling 3 lush pots of dittany. The leaves were thick and vivid green, with a faint fuzz along the edges. It was a magical plant famous for healing. Pureblood families often grew it in warm greenhouses at home. It could be used in potions, and its magic carried a defensive, restorative quality that made it difficult for dark magic to taint. Dittany's just been picked from the garden greenhouse, young master, Creaker said. Freshest there is. Regulus nodded and motioned for him to place the pots by the window. Sunlight spilled through the glass and settled on the leaves. Regulus lifted his hand, palm hovering above them, and let his magic spread over the plant. Following the inheritance's logic, he started by sensing Dittany's magical roots. The power ran along the veins, gathered at the tips, and carried a warm, gentle comfort with it. He let his own magic sway with the plant's rhythm, searching for the point where their currents could align. This was far more precise than when he'd worked with daisies. Aldrin's insights helped him locate the main channels quickly, skirting the stubborn knots where a plant naturally guarded its own magic. 15 minutes passed before he finally felt it, a faint warmth sliding into his palm. That magic held the clean freshness of grass and leaves. It was nothing like his own, gentle but unshakably steady. Regulus shifted his fingers and guided it to his fingertips, condensing it into a pale gold bead no larger than a pinhead. Then, with a thought, he split the skin near it, a shallow cut, just enough to redden. He pressed the pale gold bead over the wound. The sting vanished almost instantly. After half a minute, the irritated skin began to close. After a minute, it scabbed. After 3, the scab fell away, leaving only the faintest mark. It wasn't as strong as a healing potion brewed from dittany juice, but the method was right. He'd skipped harvesting, grinding, brewing, all of it. He'd extracted the plant's healing magic directly. As he compared it in his head, he realized it was different from a healing charm's blunt force repair. This felt closer to a plant's own process, cell division, tissue rebuilding, slow but natural. He placed his palm over the leaves again. This time he sped up. He split his magic into 2 threads, one synchronizing with the plant, the other giving a light guiding push. His efficiency jumped by half compared to the first attempt. On the 3rd extraction, he felt the plant's flow slow. He looked up at the pot. The leaves that had been such a bright green had dulled. Their edges began to droop, and the outermost leaf even showed a hint of yellowing. Regulus withdrew at once. Warmth still lingered in his fingertips. The reason clicked immediately. Magic was the foundation of a magical plant the way blood was for a human body. If you took too much, it would wither. Worse, it could revert into an ordinary plant and lose its magical properties entirely. Regulus extended his hand and fed a small amount of his own magic back along the leaf veins, combing it gently through the plant and mimicking the steady pace of natural growth. 10 minutes later, the drooping dittany perked up. The yellowing didn't spread, but the lost sheen didn't fully return. That gave him a clear conclusion. The core of verdant magic was symbiosis, not plunder. Extraction and nourishment had to be balanced. For the rest of the day, Regulus practiced. At one point, Orion came up to the attic. He stood in the doorway for a while, watching without interrupting. There was something about Regulus's concentration that reminded him of how the ancestors' notes described those who truly went far in magic. Only a wizard who could sit down and sharpen a skill, day after day, ever reached real heights. Regulus never noticed his father's visit. He was caught up in a new discovery. Different attributes of verdant magic could briefly coexist. He mixed Dittany's warm, soothing magic with the sharp magic of a thorn flower, adjusting the ratio, and guided it onto a cut at his fingertip. The healing was faster than using either alone. And the healed skin was smoother, with no faint mark left behind. It made him realize verdant magic's potential wasn't limited to single attributes. The combinations mattered. Then he began blending verdant magic with his own spell work. When he cast Protego, he threaded in a small amount of magical mince cool magic, making the shield not only resist impacts but also ease the mental pressure that came when a barrier cracked under force. He also tried combining Fluxweed's thick, clinging magic with Aguamenti, so the water wouldn't only put out flames but could also neutralize mild toxins. He tested it with a small amount of venomous tentacula juice. With Fluxweed's magic mixed into the stream, he spread it over a fingertip scratch left by the venomous tentacula. The swelling and itch faded quickly, proving the combination really did work. This path was real. Regulus stayed in his room all day. Orion knew his son was practicing inherited magic and didn't let anyone disturb him. At dusk, Walburga knocked on his door. Regulus. Dinner. At the table, Walburga praised his performance at the Malfoys' gathering first. Regulus, you did very well at the Malfoy dinner, she said as she cut into a piece of roast lamb, pride thick in her voice. Steady, proper. You gave House Black plenty of face. Regulus kept his eyes on his plate and cut his vegetables without answering. In the next few days, I've already arranged everything, Walburga went on, setting down her knife and fork and dabbing at the corner of her mouth with her napkin. It's holiday. Don't stay shut up in your room all day. Go out, meet the other heirs. The Malfoys, the Knots, the Yaxleys. You'll be working alongside them in the future. As she spoke, her eyes brightened. Connections between pure-blood families should be built young. Later, you'll support each other. That's the foundation of Black honor. Regulus set his fork down and lifted his head. His grey eyes were calm as they held hers. Mother, I want to practice magic right now. Walburga's brows rose. She clearly hadn't expected him to push back. Practice can be done slowly. Social ties matter too. Her frown deepened. House Black can't stand on magic alone. Relationships. Relationships are built on power, Regulus cut in, his voice steady. If I don't have enough strength, they won't even look at me. Walburga opened her mouth, ready to argue, and then stopped. She couldn't find the words, because he was right. I'm 11, Regulus continued, unhurried. The power I've shown already makes them take me seriously. If I get stronger, strong enough that they have to look up at me. He held her gaze. Then it won't be my job to maintain those relationships. It'll be their job to figure out how to please House Black. Pure-blood honor isn't kept alive by dinners, he said, still calm, still firm. It's kept alive by power people don't dare to dismiss. You know it. That man has never cared who knows who. He cares who can offer real value. Walburga's expression shifted. Silence fell. More than anything in her life, she cared about House Black's honor and standing. She was fanatical about pure-blood pride, but she wasn't mindless. She stared at her son for a few seconds, then finally nodded. You're right. Power is the foundation. Then her tone softened. But you can't only practice. Magic matters, but so does your body. Chapter 60, Some Thoughts and Apparition Bonus. After dinner, Regulus returned to his room. He stood at the window, watching the London street outside dusted with a thin layer of snow. Farther off, Muggle lights blurred into soft halos behind the snowfall. They looked almost dreamlike, and Regulus could feel the faint dividing line where that ordinary world met the invisible magical barriers around Grimmauld Place. He thought of Walburga's expression at the table. It wasn't that she lacked maternal affection. It was simply that it always came second to honor. Her eyes always held that particular shine, something hot and stubborn that never truly cooled. She'd praised him for the way he'd carried himself at the Malfoys' dinner, said he'd brought glory to House Black, said the other families now understood the Blacks had an heir with a dazzling future ahead of him. Regulus dragged a finger across the cold glass and drew a smiley face. He did understand Walburga, or rather, he understood people like her. She didn't want her son to be happy and comfortable. What she wanted was for him to become the finest badge she could display in her social circle. Family honor was her faith, and her children were offerings placed on its altar. The brighter the offering, the higher she believed it lifted her in the eyes of that faith. A mother like that wasn't difficult to handle, though. You listened to what she said. You told her what she wanted to hear. The important part wasn't how much truth he spoke. It was whether his words made her believe, more deeply than ever, that she'd raised a son who could lead House Black back to its peak, or even beyond it. If he gave her enough material to boast about, she'd sink into the glorious fantasy she'd woven for herself, satisfied, and she'd stop interfering with what he actually needed to do. Regulus stepped away from the window and sat at his desk. His verdant magic practice was finally settling into a steady rhythm. Magical plants truly did carry natural tendencies in their magic, as instinctive as water flowing downhill or flame climbing upward. Wizards usually took those tendencies and turned them into drinkable potions through boiling, mixing, fermenting, and ritual. Regulus skipped all of that and guided the raw magic itself. The direction was right, but the efficiency was laughable. A whole dittany plant's magic could only heal a small cut, and growing a single dittany plant took a full 3 months. Still, Eldrin's memories told him it wouldn't stay like this forever. Once he could stir the life of an entire forest, draw on the surging power of a river, even touch the natural force hidden in storms and lightning, then it would become something truly worth devoting himself to. Right now, he was still at the starting line. He only held a few seeds in his hands, but at least he knew where to plant them. He leaned back in his chair and let his mind drift. His current magic system felt like something assembled from spare parts. Star-guided meditation laid the foundation, and everything else was stacked on top. He could do a bit of everything, but nothing ran deep. Nothing, not yet, could become the kind of absolute power that decided a battle on its own. When a wizard's strength was still developing, learning a handful of powerful spells really could boost combat ability quickly. A disarming charm could still drop plenty of people, and Protego could block most attacks. But if he wanted to climb higher, spells alone wouldn't be enough. That was like building a tower out of sand. No matter how high you stacked it, it was still sand, and one wave could wash it away. He thought of Dumbledore and Grindelwald. Neither of them had been powerful because of a single spell. They had their own understanding of magic, a complete system, and the ability to weave different branches together. He wasn't sure whether Voldemort counted the same way. Dumbledore had said clearly that Voldemort had gone farther down the road of dark magic than anyone, and that his understanding of death ran deeper than anyone else's. But Voldemort did love to open with the killing curse, and he rarely relied on much else. Harry Potter's habit of winning everything with a disarming charm didn't count. That was just ridiculous. Regulus brought his thoughts back and kept going. He was still in a rapid growth phase. His talent meant his ceiling was high, and aside from magic that required a specific gift, he had almost no obvious weaknesses. So until he found his true core path, developing broadly was the best answer. Space magic was a good direction, and apparition was the first step into that field. In the original course at Hogwarts, apparition was taught in 6th year, and you had to pass a Ministry of Magic test to use it legally. That, in itself, was interesting. Space magic should have been high-level power, yet it had become something students could learn. The most likely reason was that apparition's principle was relatively straightforward. You moved your wand, fixed your destination, held your will steady, kept your intent clear, and you could tear space and relocate. For Regulus, those conditions were already met. Learning it shouldn't be difficult. More importantly, apparition would let him brush against the nature of space itself, laying groundwork for exploring more complex spatial magic later. He needed the skill, not only for mobility, but for understanding the rules of space, the same way verdant magic helped him understand the nature of natural magic. He stood, straightened his robe sleeves, and left his room. Orion was in his study, working through a backlog of Wisengamot documents. His quill scratched softly across parchment as he marked a clause without even glancing up. When Regulus knocked, Orion said, "Come in," and kept writing. Regulus stepped inside and stopped in front of the desk. Orion finished the last few words, set the quill down, and leaned back in his high-backed chair, looking at his son and waiting. "I want to learn apparition," Regulus said plainly. "I need you to supervise." He wasn't terrified of splinching, but he wasn't reckless either. More than that, the house had anti-apparition wards, and Orion would have to lift them. Orion studied him for 2 seconds, then nodded. He closed the open file, stood, and said, "Training room." The black iron door to the family training room opened slowly. Orion crossed to a rune array by the wall, raised his wand, and a streak of silver light flashed. "The anti-apparition charm is lifted," he said. "Only for this room. Don't try to jump outside." The training room settled back into stillness. Regulus walked to the center, his wand sliding into his palm. For no good reason, he suddenly thought about what this old house would become 20 years later. The Weasley twins would turn this training room into their workshop, filling it with bizarre experiments and inventions, blasting the walls and floor into worse ruin than even Regulus's last duel with Orion had left behind. By then, the Fidelius's charm would probably be the only thing still holding, assuming it hadn't been placed later. The other protections, including the anti-apparition charm Orion had just lifted, would have long since failed. Like the house itself had died, leaving only an empty shell. All the magic that once felt alive would have vanished with its masters. Sirius, what a wasteful idiot! Regulus pulled himself back and focused on the present. Orion stood near the door, voice even as he laid out the rules. 3 things you must remember. Your destination must be clear, your will must be firm, and your intent must be sharp. Miss any one of them and you can splinch. Best case, you leave behind a few hairs. Worst case, you leave behind an arm or a leg. Regulus nodded, eyes settling on the stone platform in the far corner. That was his target. He drew in a breath and held his wand level. Apparition. The squeeze hit instantly from every side. That strange sensation of rubber tubing returned. The walls of the invisible tube pressed inward all at once. The air was forced out of his lungs. His ribs creaked under the pressure. His vision dimmed, and a sharp ringing filled his ears. Then, in the next heartbeat, it vanished. He was standing beside the stone platform, wand still in hand. Orion was watching him. His face stayed blank, but something like approval flickered in his eyes. One try, one success. Of course. Regulus stayed where he was, carefully replaying every sensation from that single moment. This was different from side-along apparition with Orion. Back then, Regulus had been a passenger, dragged along, forced to endure the squeeze and release with no control at all. It was also different from Kriaker's space travel. A house elf's magic felt like it had no process, like you blinked and the world changed around you. This time, Regulus had been the one in control. He'd felt space forced open by sheer power, a seam pried apart. He'd pushed into that seam and pushed out the other end. Tearing space open and crawling through from one side to the other worked, but it was rough, blunt, and completely inelegant. Orion walked over. How does it feel? Like getting stuffed into a pipe, Regulus said, rolling his shoulders as if to loosen his body. And then having to shove myself out the other end. That's exactly it. A faint smile touched Orion's mouth. Do it a few more times and you'll get used to it. Once you're used to it, it won't feel so awful. Regulus didn't answer. He lifted his left hand and slowly traced his fingertips through the air, as if drawing an invisible path. Because in that instant, he'd seen something. Chapter 61, Spatial Perception Bonus. Regulus's perceptive gift had been with him since birth. The faint silver traces left behind when magic moved, the rippling creases that appeared when space was forcibly twisted, the glittering points of power along the edges of pried open seams, all of it, all the things you normally couldn't see, rose up in that brief instant and laid themselves bare. He knew it immediately. His perception had grown. At first, he'd only been able to sense that magic existed at all. Later, he'd learned to read a plant's mood and condition. Now he could even catch the outline of space shifting, faint and hazy, but undeniably there. It was still blurred, more shape and direction than detail, but it had gone from nothing to something. That could mean a lot. It meant finer control when he cast. It meant he could notice an incoming spell's path earlier when he was under attack. It meant he could push deeper, closer to the real question of what magic changed, and how it changed it. I'm doing it again, Regulus said. Orion stepped back to the doorway, arms folded, and gave him an easy, permissive gesture. Then came the second attempt. The third. The fourth. Each one felt a little clearer than the last. The resistance the instant space was forced open. The line his magic carved as it tore through. The awkward, sickening squeeze as his body was compressed and released again. He started to adjust to the brutality of it, and when the pressure hit, he even learned to manage his breathing so the whole thing went a fraction smoother. After the fifth apparition, Orion finally spoke. That's enough for today. If you keep going, you risk problems. When your mind can't hold steady, that's when splinching happens. Regulus stopped. His will still felt firm, and he wasn't tired yet, but he accepted it. It gave him time to digest what he'd gained. Repeated apparition drains you fast, Orion said, coming closer and pressing a hand to Regulus's shoulder. When you're starting out, don't do more than 10 a day. Once you're used to it, we'll talk. Understood. Regulus barely heard him. His thoughts were fixed on what he'd seen. Space felt like an elastic membrane. Apparition was stabbing a hole through it and forcing your way in. So what if you did it differently? What if you didn't punch a hole at all, but made the membrane dip, creating a smooth chute you could slide along? Or even more than that, what if the membrane itself carried you from one side to the other? Orion reactivated the training room's anti-apparition charm. This time, Regulus could feel the change clearly. Something closed around them, like an invisible wall sealing into place. He stopped Orion as he turned to leave. "Let me try again." Orion raised an eyebrow, then nodded. With the anti-apparition charm restored, apparition wouldn't succeed. There was no real danger. Regulus lifted his wand, still aiming for the stone platform. Apparition. His magic surged. The familiar squeeze returned, and then nothing. Space didn't open. That invisible wall was solid in front of him, hard as real stone. It felt like shoving against a thick, unmoving block with every ounce of strength he had, and the wall didn't give at all. The backlash snapped down his wand and into his arm. Regulus staggered back half a step, caught himself quickly, and felt a faint numbness shiver through his wrist. But he'd seen it clearly. The anti-apparition charm looked like a net, woven from dense strands of magic, stretched tight over the entire room. Apparition had to tear through that net to pass, but the weave was too strong, too elastic. With his current power, he couldn't rip it at all. Which raised an obvious question. How did house elves do it? Regulus remembered Christmas Day, when Kriaker had brought him back from King's Cross to Grimmauld Place. There had been no squeeze, no tearing, none of that suffocating sensation of being shoved through a tube. It had felt as if space itself simply stepped aside and let them through, like a door held open for a moment. "Father." Regulus turned to Orion and lowered his wand. "House elf space magic isn't the same as apparition, is it?" Orion blinked, caught off guard. It was clear he'd never really considered it. He frowned, thinking for a few seconds before answering, hesitant. "Elf magic is different, yes. They don't use wands. A lot of their magic seems inborn. They don't learn it. Apparition is a skill wizards have to practice. For them, it's probably as natural as walking. They can cross anti-apparition wards," Regulus said flatly. "Yes." Orion nodded. "Why?" Regulus pressed. Orion went quiet for longer this time. He walked to the wall and ran his fingers over the carved runes in the stone, then finally shook his head. "No wizard has studied it. Most don't pay much attention to elf magic." Regulus knew what most meant. It meant almost all. Wizards had grown used to house elves. They could clean, cook, look after children. No one asked how they did it, because it worked, and that was enough. Arrogance, carved right into the bones of the world. For thousands of years, wizards had stood at the top of the magical food chain. Even when they acknowledged other races, it was with a faint, casual condescension. Goblins minted coin. Centaurs watched the stars. Giants had brute strength. But wizards had wisdom, civilization, a system of magic passed down generation after generation. And house elves? A bit of household magic. Nothing worth discussing. Yet Regulus knew about the cave Voldemort had used to hide a Horcrux. Even Dumbledore couldn't apparate directly inside, and he'd been forced to take a boat across that in Fairy Lake. Kriaker, though, had come and gone freely. That was not something household magic could explain. "Kriaker," Regulus called softly. Without a sound, the house elf appeared in the corner of the training room, still wearing that filthy tea towel, a rag in his hand as if he'd been cleaning somewhere. "Young master," called Kriaker. Kriaker's eyes flicked between Regulus and Orion. His ears twitched with nervous energy. "Take me through space once," Regulus ordered. "From here to the entrance hall, then bring me back." Kriaker looked to Orion, silent and questioning. Orion nodded. "Do as he says." Only then did Kriaker extend his thin, wrinkled hand. There was dust caught beneath his nails. This time, Regulus put all of his focus into sensing. He was absolutely sure there was no squeeze, no tearing, not even a clear surge of magic. He only felt the space around them ripple, like water disturbed by a fingertip. A soft distortion formed around him and Kriaker, so subtle it was almost nothing. And then they were standing in the entrance hall. The fire in the hearth burned brightly, snapping and crackling. The portraits on the walls turned as one. Some yawned, Some frowned, a few leaned together to whisper. Regulus stood perfectly still. He saw it. Space had folded, just slightly, and handed him from one side to the other. Like folding a sheet of paper. 2 points that were far apart suddenly touched when the paper bent. No wonder it could bypass anti-apparition wards. That net of magic was built to resist tearing and piercing, but it couldn't stop folding. The net was still there, intact, but the path no longer went through it. It went around it, slipping beneath without ever forcing its way through. Back, Regulus said. Kreaker brought him to the training room again. Orion was still waiting, watching him closely. You felt it. Completely different, Regulus said, already sorting every detail in his mind. Apparition is forcing your way through. If you can't open the door, you smash a hole in the wall. Elves take a detour. The wall stays, but they dig a tunnel underneath it. A detour? Orion frowned. How do you detour through space? Space can fold, Regulus tried, and realized how impossible it was to put into words. Like two cities on a map. They're far apart, but if you fold the map, they end up side by side. Orion considered that seriously, tapping a finger lightly against his wand handle. After a long moment, he still shook his head. I can't picture it. But if you can sense it, remember the feeling. Magical perception is your gift. It'll be a strong advantage. Regulus nodded, knowing Orion struggled with abstractions. But Regulus's mind was already elsewhere. If he could learn to fold space like that, he didn't even have to master it completely. House elf magic might be tied to their species. Wizards might never replicate it in full. But if he understood the principle, even if he could only imitate a tiny fraction of it. Chapter 62, Spatial Shifting. Over the next 3 days, Regulus didn't practice apparition again. Once you had it, you had it. He spent all his time in his room instead, and his desk became a mess of random objects. A few quills. 2 ink bottles. A roll of parchment. Several galleons and sickles. Even the black family brooch he usually wore. Regulus picked up the brooch and laid it in his palm. He closed his eyes and let his perception spread. In his senses, the room's spatial structure took on a strange shape, an invisible net made of countless nodes and lines. Every object occupied a particular point on that net, and no 2 points felt the same. Some were dense. Some were strong. Some vibrated with a faint, living hum. The brooch's node sat right in the center of his palm, fine and stable. He wanted the net itself to move. Like Kreaker had done. Fold the net, bring 2 nodes close together, then pass the brooch from this one to that one. The theory was simple. Doing it was something else entirely. On the first day, the brooch didn't move at all. On the second day, the air around it began to warp slightly. The edges of nearby objects wavered, just a little, like heat shimmer. But the brooch stayed planted in his palm, not even shifting a millimeter. On the third afternoon, Regulus changed his approach. He stopped trying to fold the whole room. That was far beyond him. Instead, he focused on making only the tiny patch of space around the brooch move, even if it was barely anything. He concentrated until his thoughts felt razor thin. Magic gathered in his palm. No incantation, no wand movement, only will, perception and magic working together. He locked onto the brooch's node and imagined it like a buoy on water, sliding gently toward a nearby empty point, drifting along some invisible slope instead of being shoved. The air around the brooch pulsed violently. The structure of space rippled in rings no eyes could see. At the center of those ripples, the brooch began to blur, turning faint and translucent, and then it vanished. Regulus's eyes snapped open. The brooch was gone from his palm. It wasn't on the desk. It wasn't on the carpet. It wasn't anywhere in the room. There wasn't even a trace left behind. 3 seconds stretched like taffy, each one unbearably slow. Then came a soft, sharp sound. The brooch dropped onto the edge of his desk, about 5 centimeters from where it had been, the silver surface warm to the touch. He'd done it. It had only moved 5 centimeters. He'd nearly lost it to whatever nowhere lay between points. The magic cost had been ridiculous. But it was a success. Something he'd worked out himself, based on the barest sliver of understanding about space. Regulus picked up the brooch, still faintly warm, and rubbed his thumb over the star etched into it. In a duel, mobility was one of the deadliest advantages you could have. Your spells could be vicious. Your power could be overwhelming. If you couldn't hit your opponent, it meant nothing. That was why apparition was considered important magic. It let a wizard appear out of nowhere, vanish just as fast, strike once, and slip away before the other side could react. But apparition had limits. It required a moment of preparation. It couldn't be chained endlessly. It had distance constraints. Anti-apparition wards could shut it down completely. If one day he could truly master this sort of spatial shifting. It didn't have to be his entire body hopping around, though that would be ideal. It could be his spells. A disarming charm could shoot out, vanish mid-flight, and reappear behind an enemy. A protego could form from far away and wrap around someone else instead, a reversed protection that pinned them in place and made it impossible to cast. And if he pushed the thought even further? If his spatial perception grew sharper, could he see the structure inside a body? Could he make a spell bypass every external defense and detonate inside a person's organs or brain? Protego, shield spells, every kind of ward and charm, all of it would become decoration. No process. No warning. You acted, and the result was already there. That was like striking at cause and effect itself. Regulus set the brooch down and walked to the window. Night had fallen. Snow had started again, flakes drifting down to melt into tiny beads of water on the glass. London's lights blurred into soft patches behind the curtain of snow, impossible to tell which belonged to muggles and which to wizards. The ideas were exciting, but it was far too early. Right now they were castles in the air, without even a foundation poured. He'd only just touched the edge of space magic. Verdant magic had only just begun. Transfiguration was still groundwork. None of it was solid yet, and all of it demanded time and focus. But at least he had direction. A road no one else had walked, a road carved from understanding the nature of magic itself. Dash. At dinner, Walburga brought up Sirius again. That ungrateful boy. She spat, sawing into her steak as if it were an enemy. Knife and fork scraped against the plate with an awful, sharp sound. Didn't come home for Christmas, didn't even write a letter. What did the Potters pour into his head, that he'd throw away his own name? Orion kept his head down, eating his roast potatoes in silence. Regulus also stayed quiet, cutting his lamb into neat, even pieces and eating them one by one. They both understood. Walburga didn't want a discussion. She wanted to vent. If anyone answered, she'd latch onto it and keep going for half an hour. If no one did, she'd burn herself out and stop. Fast to ignite, fast to fade. Regulus though thought, this is only the beginning. Sirius hadn't come home this Christmas, so Walburga raged for an evening. If he didn't come back next year, she'd rage for 3 days. And when he stopped coming home entirely, moved in with the Potters for good, she'd pull this performance out every Christmas and recite it all over again. From ungrateful son to traitor. From throwing away the name to not deserving the name. Like a play that never changed, lines memorized, emotions rehearsed on cue. Walburga went on for about 10 minutes before she finally stopped. She set her utensils down, lifted her wineglass, and took a long swallow of red wine. The anger hadn't fully drained from her face, her cheeks still flushed with agitation. Then she turned to Regulus. Oh, right. Her tone softened suddenly, deliberately casual, as if she'd just remembered some small detail. Several people have been praising you lately. Mrs. Malfoy, Mrs. Knott, and Mrs. Yaxley. They keep hinting that you are going to amount to something extraordinary. She watched him with curiosity, and with that familiar expectation that always carried a hint of prideful display. Regulus knew that look too well. He'd seen it his entire life. You're... Walburga leaned forward, lowering her voice as if she were fishing for a secret. How far along are you now? The way they talk, it's like you'll be walking into the Ministry of Magic tomorrow and taking the minister's chair. Regulus set his fork down, lifted his napkin, and dabbed at the corner of his mouth. Then he looked toward Orion at the far end of the table. With Walburga, you couldn't tell the whole truth. She wasn't Orion. She didn't weigh risks calmly, and she didn't keep things quiet. If she knew something, it meant every lady in her tea circle would know it too. Tell her today, and tomorrow the whole pure-blood world would be talking about how brilliant the youngest Black had become. But he also couldn't refuse completely. She needed something real to show off, proof that her son was better than everyone else's. If he gave her nothing, she'd keep pressing, or she'd start inventing theories on her own, and that was worse. There was no telling what absurd conclusion she'd reach. Orion caught his son's glance and set his wineglass down. Regulus does have some talent, he said, steady as if he were delivering a report at the Wiesengamot. Most of the first-year material at Hogwarts, he's already mastered. Some higher-year content, he's studying on his own. Walburga's eyes lit instantly. Like what? For example, apparition, Orion said simply. I practiced with him 2 days ago. He succeeded on his first attempt. Truly. Walburga's voice jumped, delight flooding her face. He's only 11. He is. Orion nodded and continued, listing each point with the same measured calm. In potions, Professor Slughorn says his current level is already beyond 5th years. In transfiguration, Professor McGonagall has been personally guiding him, and she even gave him a copy of her own research notes. In charms, Professor Flitwick often awards him extra points. He says Regulus's standard is far above his classmates. With every item, Walburga's smile widened. The light in her eyes grew brighter and brighter. By the time Orion finished, she looked as if she were glowing, the joy and pride rising up from her so strongly it nearly spilled over. I knew it. She declared, pure triumph in her voice. My Regulus has been different since he was little. Those other ladies' sons, what are they? One's good at Quidditch, another can brew a decent potion. Our Regulus can do everything. Chapter 63, all of it belongs to me. Walburga started comparing again, stacking Regulus up against every pure-blood heir she'd ever heard of. No matter how many names she ran through, she always landed in the same place. Her Regulus was the best of them all. Regulus kept his head down and went on eating the lamb chop on his plate, already a little cool. Orion picked his knife and fork back up and cut into his roast potatoes. Neither of them offered anything deeper. Verdant magic. The experiments with spatial shifting. The progress on star-guided meditation. What Regulus had been absorbing from the restricted section, including the darker knowledge tucked into those shelves. The strategies they'd been building in the quiet, for Voldemort and the Death Eaters that were gathering in his shadow. Walburga didn't need to know any of that. She couldn't know. It wasn't her world to worry about, and it wasn't a field she should ever step into. But what Orion had just said was more than enough to keep her glowing for months. It would carry her through tea parties, dinners, and every social gathering she attended, letting her drop hints with a smile and watch other women's faces tighten. She'd become an object of envy. More families would angle for alliances and marriages with the Blacks. More resources would drift their way, simply because people liked the look of Regulus's future. That was what they needed. Then, what about after he graduates? Walburga asked, her voice bright with yearning. How far can he go? The Ministry of Magic? The Wiesengamot? Or like Dumbledore? Regulus nearly choked on the sheer audacity of it. You really just said that out loud? Dumbledore? Even he didn't allow himself dreams that ridiculous. Not yet. Someday, maybe. Orion went quiet for a few seconds, genuinely wrong-footed. Dumbledore was the greatest wizard of the century. If he lived into the next one. Orion's eyes slid, almost without meaning to, toward Regulus. If Dumbledore really lived into the next century, it wasn't guaranteed who would end up standing taller. At the rate he's progressing, Orion said at last, meeting Walburga's eager stare with a thoughtful calm, after graduation, he should reach the level of an elite Auror. Even in the most extreme, worst-case scenario, even if Regulus somehow lost every spark of instinct and brilliance he had, it was still the safest estimate. What Orion didn't say was that if Regulus kept moving at this pace, he wouldn't need to wait until graduation at all. By the end of 3rd year, he'd likely surpass most working Aurors. And by 17. Orion didn't let himself finish that thought. He didn't want to imagine it too clearly, because it started to look like the kind of talent people compared to a young Dumbledore, or even Grindelwald. But he could never say any of that to Walburga. She'd leap to her feet and dance right there, then spend tomorrow telling everyone she knew that her son would be head of the Auror office by 2nd year. It would shove Regulus straight into the spotlight, drawing attention he didn't need, and jealousy he couldn't afford. Possibly outright hostility. Worse, it might pull Voldemort's gaze in a sharper, more direct way. Not a distant feeler, not an invitation passed through others. Voldemort himself, stepping in personally, making an offer that was hard to refuse. That would be real trouble. An elite Auror. Walburga echoed, savoring the words like they were sweet on her tongue, her smile blazing as if she'd just downed an entire bottle of Felix Felicis. Good. Good. The Black family is finally going to produce a true pillar of the wizarding world. Let's see who dares claim we've got no future now. She launched straight into daydreams, carrying Regulus from the Ministry of Magic all the way to the minister's chair. The Blacks rising again to the top of the sacred 28. 12. Grimmauld Place bustling with visitors, pure-blood families lining up to flatter and fawn, eager to curry favor. Regulus listened quietly. He nodded now and then, but his mind had already drifted elsewhere. Which plant should he try tomorrow for verdant magic? Mandrake was still too risky, but maybe venomous tentacula. Or devil's snare, if he prepared properly. Spatial shifting cost too much. He needed a way to reduce the drain, or it would never be usable in a real fight. His occlumency model, that labyrinth built from star paths, was nearly complete, but he still needed to test its defenses a few more times. And there were those books in the restricted section about passive magic. He needed to find time to skim and copy a few more. The road ahead was long. There was still far too much to learn. One dinner wasn't enough to sort through every plan and preparation he needed. But at least one thing was certain. He was moving forward on this path step by step, and every step felt solid under his feet. Outside the window, the snow kept falling, layer after layer settling over London's streets and rooftops. It muffled the noise of muggles, and it muffled the secrets of wizards too. Inside 12 Grimmauld Place, the fire Indiana, the hearth burned hot. The flames threw dancing shadows across the dining room walls while the family sat around their long table. A mother lost in visions of glory, wrapped up in the future she'd woven for herself. A father weighing reality like a set of scales, calculating risks and rewards with every breath. A son plotting his own road, thinking about how to grow stronger, how to go farther. Such a warm, lovely Black family. A few days before the holiday ended, Orion set down the Daily Prophet at breakfast. "Come with me today," he said, cutting off a piece of fried egg as he looked at Regulus. "We're going to check on the family businesses." Regulus lifted his head. He was spreading butter over bread, and something in his chest shifted with interest. He didn't speak. He just watched his father, waiting. Orion took a sip of coffee before continuing. "You're going to take over the Black family someday. You can't spend your whole life only at Hogwarts and Grimmauld Place. There are things you should see." Regulus nodded, took a bite of the buttered bread, chewed, swallowed, then said simply, "All right." This wasn't wasted time. The Black family's businesses were going to be his one day anyway. Learning them now meant getting familiar with what already belonged to him. And going out with Orion meant seeing more of the wizarding world than he ever could from a school castle and a London townhouse. After breakfast, Regulus went upstairs and changed into a dark robe. He slid his wand into the inner pocket, then pinned the Black family brooch neatly to his chest. When he came down again, Orion was already waiting in the entry hall. He held a rolled parchment covered in cramped writing. "First, the shops in Diagon Alley." Orion unfurled the parchment and glanced over it. "Then the potion workshop in the Scottish Highlands, the alchemy workshop in Wales, the herb gardens in Cornwall, the magical creature breeding grounds in Ireland, and finally Nocturne Alley." As Orion spoke, Regulus understood immediately. By the time they finished, they'd have crossed half the British Isles. "For the far locations, we'll use portkeys," Orion said, rolling the parchment back up. "You can't apparate somewhere you've never been." They stepped to the center of the hall. Orion extended his left hand, and Regulus placed his own on top. The familiar crushing pull hit, and a few seconds later they were standing in a quiet side alley off Diagon Alley, with the dark, grim wall of the Nocturne Alley entrance behind them. The Black family owned 3 shops in Diagon Alley. The first was a potion shop, set in the middle stretch of the street. The sign above the door read, "Silver Moon Apothecary." It wasn't large, but the location was excellent. The display window was packed with potion bottles in unsettling colors, each one labeled neatly. Skelegro, Pepper-Up Potion, Baruffio's Brain Elixir, Draught of Living Death, Elixir to Induce Euphoria. All common stock. Regulus couldn't help wondering if the family also had a potion shop in Nocturne Alley, selling the sort of things Diagon Alley wouldn't touch. A thin, tall wizard was organizing supplies behind the counter. The second he spotted Orion, he straightened like he'd been yanked by a string. "Mr. Black," he said, respectful. "Marcus." Orion dipped his head with restrained acknowledgement. I reviewed this month's turnover. Up 7% from last month. Yes. Marcus smiled, clearly pleased. The new sleep aid is selling well. A lot of parents have been coming in to buy it. Orion walked the shop, checking expiration labels on the shelves and asking several questions about suppliers. Marcus answered each one clearly, without hesitation. He knew the business inside and out. Regulus followed quietly, studying the layout, the product placement, the way customers came and went. The shop might be small, but it carried everything, from basic boils cure potions all the way up to expensive Felix Felicis. Every label sat straight. Every bottle looked freshly wiped, spotless. Marcus's grandfather worked for the Black family businesses too, Orion told Regulus after they left. His father managed the Wales herb gardens. Now it's his turn. There are many families like that. The second shop was an alchemical goods store in the northern end of Diagon Alley, its sign painted with a cauldron crossed with a wand. Inside, the items were a jumble of everything. Cauldrons that stirred themselves. Potion racks that held a steady temperature. Hourglasses that chimed the time. Wand attachments that amplified spell power. The owner was a short, stout witch with hair pulled so tight it looked painful. When she saw Orion, her eyes lit up. "Orion, you finally showed up!" She boomed. That last batch of self-stirring cauldrons had an issue. The stirring rod turns 3 times and then quits. They need reworking. Orion's brow tightened. Which workshop produced them? The Wales one. I've told them 3 times. Every time they swear they've fixed it, and every time they send the same rubbish. She planted her hands on her hips. You need to rein them in. Keep this up and the shop's name will take a hit. Orion pulled a small notebook from his pocket and jotted a few lines. I'm going to Wales this afternoon. I'll look at it myself. Chapter 64, The Real Weight of an Ancient Pureblood House Bonus. Regulus wandered the shop while Orion spoke with the owner, and his attention snagged on a cauldron edged with temperature markings. He picked it up and turned it in his hands. It was cleverly made. A heat-sensing charm had been carved into the inner wall, and the outer wall displayed the current temperature in a corresponding spot. No more guessing by instinct while brewing. If you like it, take one, the witch said, catching the movement. She winked at him. Your father won't charge you. Regulus set the cauldron back with an exaggerated sigh. Hogwarts won't let us use them. So many rules at Hogwarts. She shook her head, annoyed. My grandson goes there too. He writes home constantly just to complain. The third shop was a general store, selling all sorts of everyday magical goods. Self-sweeping brooms. Boxes that kept food fresh. Crystal balls that predicted the weather. Quills that wrote on their own. It was the largest of the 3, and it was packed. 5 or 6 customers stood in a loose line at the counter. The owner was a balding wizard, busy ringing up an elderly witch. When he spotted Orion and Regulus, he gave a brief nod in greeting without slowing his hands. Orion didn't interrupt. He walked Regulus through the shop, checked the dates on a few shelves, then glanced over the ledger near the register. Only after the owner cleared that wave of customers did Orion step up. John. Business looks good. Thanks to you. John wiped sweat from his forehead. Christmas just ended. Everyone's been buying gifts. This is Regulus, Orion said, shifting slightly to make room. My son. John studied Regulus for a moment, then smiled. He looks like you. A bit like Walbergot too. When you take over the shops someday, look after us old folk. Regulus nodded politely. Hello. When they left Diagon Alley, Orion led Regulus into an even narrower side passage. He pulled 2 battered teapot lids from his pocket and handed one to Regulus. Both looked ancient. Porte at, Orion said. Hold tight. It activates in 5 seconds. Regulus gripped the cold, rusty lid. 5 seconds later, a brutal force yanked at him like a hook had caught his navel and jerked hard. The world spun. Color and sound smeared together. This wasn't like apparition's crushing squeeze. It felt more like being flung into a laundry machine on spin cycle, and not a gentle one either. When it stopped, they were standing on a bleak stretch of highland. Wind screamed across the open ground, snapping at their robes. In the distance, grey-green hills rolled on and on. Nearby, several low stone buildings squatted against the cold, white smoke curling from their chimneys. The air was thick with herbs, layered over wet earth and rain. Scottish Highlands. Potion Workshop. Orion pocketed the portfolio and started toward the stone buildings. The workshop's overseer was an elderly wizard with graying hair and a face carved with deep lines. He wore a leather apron stained with every imaginable residue, and he held a long-handled stirring rod like it was part of him. When he saw Orion, he nodded once, expression stern. "Ingredients are up," the old wizard said as his opening greeting. "A chromantula venom from Africa is 30% higher than last year, and mooncalf horn powder from South America is up 20%. "Noted," Orion said shortly. "Let's go inside." The interior was much larger than the outside suggested. A space expansion charm had been used. A dozen huge cauldrons bubbled over enchanted flames. Wizards in matching aprons stood at each station with stirring rods, adding ingredients at intervals. The walls were covered in recipes and warnings. Shelves held hundreds of glass bottles filled with powders and liquids in every color imaginable. The old wizard led them around, explaining what each cauldron was brewing, how far along it was, and when it was expected to ship. Orion listened carefully, asking a question now and then. Regulus followed behind, watching the workers handle ingredients, control the heat, and adjust recipes on the fly. Their movements were quick and practiced. Their eyes never drifted. They were all seasoned. One younger wizard was brewing elixir to induce euphoria. The liquid threw up golden bubbles and smelled faintly sweet. "This batch will yield 30 bottles, the overseer said. "We'll bottle it tomorrow, deliver to Diagon Alley the day after." "Keep a close eye on quality," Orion warned. "Last time a customer complained the effects only lasted 3 hours. That was the ingredients." The old wizard's mouth tightened. "Billywig stingers aren't what they used to be. I'll see what I can do." After the potion workshop, they used 2 more port keys and visited the alchemy workshop in Wales, then the herb gardens in Cornwall. The Welsh alchemy workshop was built into a cave, and it was so hot inside it felt like a steam room. Dozens of anvils sat in 2 neat rows. Goblins and wizards worked side by side, the clanging of metal ringing without pause. Regulus looked around and realized this was less an alchemy workshop and more a smithy. The work didn't seem particularly sophisticated. It didn't match his picture of a proper alchemy lab at all. Then he considered what the shop in Diagon Alley sold. Most of it was meant for ordinary customers, mass-produced rather than rare or cutting-edge. Low complexity made sense. The Cornwall herb gardens sprawled across dozens of acres, hidden behind magical wards. Inside, rows upon rows of magical plants filled the land. Venomous tentacula twisted restlessly beneath glass domes. Mandrake grew in soundproof greenhouses with warning signs hung outside. The head gardener was a short witch with sun-darkened skin and thick fingers. Dirt lived under her nails. "Weather's been good this year," she spoke while loosening soil around a patch of dittany. "Yields up 20%. Only problem is the gnomes, always causing trouble. I set traps and caught more than a dozen." "Handle them the usual way," Orion said. "Sell the pelts in Nocturne Alley. Feed the meat to the animals in Ireland." Their last stop was the magical creature breeding grounds in Ireland. It was larger than everything that came before, so vast Regulus couldn't see the end. Magical fences divided it into regions, each one holding different creatures. Grindylow swam in one pond. Bowtruckles lived in a stretch of woodland. A cave housed several nogtails. On a steep, rocky rise with sparse vegetation, a grapehorn wandered at leisure. Near a tall wooden building, he caught glimpses of an Occam's feathers. The breeding grounds manager was a large man with a ruddy face and a booming voice. "Everything's in order," he promised, thumping his chest. "Only thing is feed prices keep rising. Dragon liver costs 40% more than last year." "Then pay it," Orion said easily. "Don't cut corners on the animals. If you raise them poorly, you won't sell them for a good price." Regulus stood by the fence as a bowtruckle poked its head out of a tree hollow, watching him with bright curiosity. It was only about the size of his palm, with glossy black eyes and delicate fingers. It stared for a moment, then abruptly tossed an acorn at him. It landed near his shoe. The bowtruckle immediately vanished back into the hollow, making a soft rustling sound that somehow felt like laughter. "It likes you," the manager said, laughing loudly. "Bowtruckles usually don't bother with people." It took 3 days of following Orion around before Regulus finished seeing the Black family's main holdings. Even then, it wasn't a deep dive. It was a quick sweep, the sort of tour you take to learn the outline of a place. And it was only then that he truly understood. The Black family's assets were not just the old house at 12 Grimmauld Place. Not just 3 shops in Diagon Alley. From the Scottish Highlands to the Irish coast, from Welsh valleys to the Cornwall plains, there was black land everywhere. Workshops. Plantations. Breeding grounds. And that was only on British soil. What about outside Britain? Regulus asked one night, when they were staying at an inn in Ireland. Orion sat by the fireplace with a ledger in his hands. France has vineyards for enchanted wine. Germany has mines that produce certain rare metals. India has spice plantations. North Africa has a magical creature reserve. He flipped a page. But you're going back to school soon. We'll visit the rest later. Regulus sat across from him on the bed, trying to process it all. He'd always known the Blacks were rich. He'd never understood where the money actually came from. Now he did. Potions, alchemy, herbs, magical creatures. The things the wizarding world always needed, the industries that never ran out of customers. The Black family didn't own all of it, but they had a hand in every part of it, and not in a small way. And they'd been doing it for centuries. The whole chain was connected, from growing and breeding raw materials, to processing and production, to sales and retail. An entire system, and the Blacks sat at the center of it. What surprised him even more were the people. Every manager. Every craftsman in the workshops. Every gardener in the plantations. Every handler in the breeding grounds. They didn't all carry the name Black, but they were tied to the family all the same, tangled together in thousands of quiet threads. Some families had worked for the Blacks for generations. Some were distant branches. Some were small houses that survived by clinging to the Black family's protection. It was an enormous, self-contained ecosystem. The Black family at the top, and beneath them layer upon layer of businesses and dependents, like a great tree. The trunk was the name Black. The branches and leaves were the industries. The roots were the countless people who made their living because the Blacks existed. That was the real value of an ancient pure-blood noble house. Chapter 65, Boundless Emotion, Patronus Bonus. Regulus had a clearer understanding now of what that ancient surname truly meant. It wasn't just prestige, or old portraits glaring from dark hallways. It was something real, something that shaped the lives of countless people. A thought popped into his head, so abrupt it almost made him laugh. Have I been too frugal? At Hogwarts, he never spent more than he had to. Books, supplies, necessities. That was it. But looking at it now, the Black family's wealth was the kind that didn't run out. Even if he tossed 100 galleons a day into a fire, he could keep doing it for 10 years and still not empty the vault. What could a Muggle-born or a half-blood possibly compare with? Even some pure-blood families couldn't. There were houses that had to pinch pennies just to buy a decent wand, while Regulus stood behind a name that controlled an entire chain of industries in the magical world. That gap wasn't something personal talent could bridge. It was structural, centuries old, deeply rooted. An advantage built over hundreds of years. Then another question followed right on its heels. With a foundation like this, in the life he was supposed to have, who had it benefited in the end? Even if Sirius squandered money like it was water, could he really ruin all of it? How much was the old house at 12 Grimmauld Place worth, truly? Compared to holdings spread across the British Isles, one townhouse was nothing. Maybe, in the original story, after Walburga and Orion died, the Black family's businesses had been carved up by other houses. The Malfoys taking a portion. The Lestranges taking a portion. Other pure-blood families dipping their hands in for their share. Sirius inheriting an empty shell, never realizing the real wealth had already been swallowed. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that the businesses were still in Black hands. What mattered was that one day they would be his, and no one was taking them. And then Regulus thought of Voldemort. Voldemort was a half-blood too. He hadn't been born into any of this. Unlike everyone else, though, he could take what he wanted, and he could get away with it. Regulus narrowed his eyes, thumb brushing the smooth wood of his wand as he replayed everything he'd seen these past days. Even Voldemort was not taking what belonged to him. Dash. On the afternoon of the third day, they stood on a cliff along Ireland's western coast. Below them, a black drop of rock plunged dozens of meters down. Waves hammered the stone and burst into white foam. Far out where sea met sky, the sun was sinking slowly into the water. The wind came in hard, sharp with salt, snapping Regulus's robe backward. He stood near the edge and stared. For 11 years, most of his life had been spent inside the old house at Grimmauld Place. Then he'd gone to Hogwarts, but that was still only a castle and the land that surrounded it. He hadn't seen a truly wide world. He hadn't seen mountains and oceans, wilderness and endless plains. In 3 days, he'd crossed half the British Isles with Orion. He'd seen the Scottish Highlands, bleak and magnificent. He'd seen forests in Welsh valleys, drowned in fog. He'd seen Cornwall's herb gardens bursting with life under sunlight, and he'd seen the Irish coast where the sea surged like something alive. The world was this big. The wizarding world was this rich. It wasn't only Hogwarts classrooms and corridors, Diagon Alley shops and streets, pure blood feasts that never ended and the constant politicking that came with them, and the stars overhead. There were places like this too. Open land. Grand views. Living, breathing life. Regulus drew in a deep breath of sea air, and something inside him loosened. All his life, he'd lived like a machine built for calculation. Every step planned. Every decision weighed for profit and loss. Every action measured for consequence. He'd wrapped himself in calm and reason, keeping emotion at arm's length so it wouldn't distort his judgment or disrupt his plans. But standing on this cliff, watching the sun sink into the ocean and listening to waves shatter against rock, he suddenly thought that maybe he didn't have to live so tightly wound. Magic was his path. Power was his pursuit. But even on that path, he could look at the scenery. Why did he want strength in the first place? Wasn't it so he could live freely, go anywhere he wanted, see any view he wished to see? Orion stood beside him, silent. The head of the House of Black watched his son's profile, watched grey eyes catching the sunset's gold. He noticed Regulus looked different. Not that too old calm and steadiness he wore like armor. This was something else, something Regulus's age should have, a pure focus and curiosity. Relief eased through Orion. He'd worried for years that his son carried too much weight inside him. Even as a child, Regulus rarely cried. Rarely fussed. He never ran wild. He always looked like a miniature adult. In a pure-blood family, that was praised. What parent didn't want a child who was mature and composed? Orion had taken pride in it. He still did. But as a father, he also wanted Regulus to feel good things, to taste what it meant to be alive, to be a real child who looked at the world with wonder. Now, finally, he saw the first hint of it. Regulus didn't notice his father's gaze. All of his attention was on the view ahead. The wind grew stronger, tousling his hair. He lifted a hand and let it stream between his fingers, feeling that invisible force as it passed. Then he closed his eyes and let his magic circulate naturally through his body. Something extraordinary happened. In that moment, his magic became lively, as if some restraint had been undone. It flowed through him with a lightness he'd never felt before, bright and buoyant. It was responding to him. Regulus understood all at once. Magic wasn't only a resource to calculate, control, and spend. It was alive. It changed with the witch or wizard who carried it, shifting with emotion and state of mind. When he was calm and calculating, his magic was precise and steady. When he felt moved, it became quick and joyful. Maybe those two sides weren't enemies. Magic could be a precise science. It could demand logic, careful deduction, rigorous practice. But magic could also be warm. Alive. Full of endless possibility. Like the sea below him. He could calculate tides and waves with mathematics and physics, or he could stand here and simply feel its vastness. And what was the nature of magic, really? A wizard used will and magic to influence the world. The wizard was the center. Magic was the tool. The world was what was shaped. If a wizard lived like a machine, then the magic they cast would be nothing but cold spells. But if a wizard was alive, truly alive, with emotion and awe and longing, would their magic become something different too? Regulus opened his eyes. The sun had already sunk halfway. The sea looked like it was on fire, gleaming gold red. A seabird rose from below the cliff, spread its wings, and circled on an updraft. The idea he'd clung to for so long began to loosen. Maybe he didn't have to choose between rational calculation and emotional experience. Maybe he could have both. Plan the road with reason. Experience the journey with feeling. Control magic with calculation, and understand magic with the heart. Maybe that was better. The instant the thought formed, his wand was already in his hand. He gave himself to the rush rising in his chest, a pressure that had been building far too long. His longing for freedom, his hunger for the wider world, his desire to break every chain, and the pure, immediate emotion of standing before something so vast and beautiful. It was stronger than anything he'd felt before. Stronger than the satisfaction of mastering a new spell. Stronger than the control of defeating an opponent. Stronger than the quiet fullness of gaining knowledge. This was deeper, something that surged up from the soul. Being alive is good. The world is beautiful. I want to see more. I want to feel more. I want to become more. Magic boiled in his body, bursting past the calm circulation of star-guided meditation. It rushed like a jubilant stream, each thread of it carrying the same feeling. Joy, longing, freedom, and hunger. Regulus raised his wand. Orion turned, his thoughts shifting from quiet pride to confusion. He had no idea what Regulus intended. The place, the time, the whole scene didn't look like a practice session. Regulus wasn't paying attention to his father anymore. He drew in a breath, filling his lungs with salt wind. He let the sunset's gold flood his eyes. He let the roar of the waves fill his ears. He pushed that swelling emotion to its peak. Then, facing into the wind, bathed in the fading light, he spoke the incantation. Expecto Patronum. Silver-white light erupted from the tip of his wand, pouring out like a broken dam. In an instant it lit the cliff's edge, wrapping Regulus in brilliance. The light was powerful but not harsh. It felt warm like a fire in winter, pure like snow on a high mountain. The silver glow began to gather. Chapter 66, A True Desire, The Starlight Kite. The silver-white light suddenly collapsed inward, shrinking into a hazy, pulsing knot. Then it stretched, unfurled, and began to take shape. Wings pushed out from either side, each feather made of pure silver glow, its edges dusted with points of light like tiny stars. A sleek, powerful body formed, head lifting, beak sharpening, eyes becoming two brighter sparks of silver. At last, the tail feathers spread wide, trailing like a comet. A silver bird hovered before Regulus. It was somewhere between an eagle and a kite in size, its wings built from countless fine fragments of light. With the faintest movement, those fragments flickered like starlight winking in and out. The tips of its feathers were a clean, perfect silver, and in the dying sunlight they refracted a halo of color, almost like a rainbow mist. Its eyes were bright silver grey, so close to Regulus's own that it hit him like a jolt. The gaze was sharp, and deep. It spread its wings and held steady without flapping, suspended as if gravity had simply stopped applying to it. Fine grains of stardust drifted from the edges of its wings. When they touched the ground, the shadows within a few meters thinned, as if darkness itself had been pushed back. Regulus stared at it, and a strange feeling rose in his chest, like he was looking into a mirror. A thought surfaced, sudden and undeniable. This wasn't something he had manufactured. It wasn't a creature he'd constructed with spellwork and raw magic. It had grown from inside him. It was the shape of his deepest desire made real, the projection of some part of his soul. A patroness answered the truest thing in your heart. So what did he truly want? Regulus asked himself, quietly, with complete honesty. He wanted real freedom. Not the small-minded version some people dreamed of, an excuse to indulge themselves and call it independence. He wanted the freedom to choose his path, to live without being tied down by anyone's leash. He wanted the endless night sky. He wanted to break past the boundaries of the physical world, to reach places others declared impossible. He wanted power, so he could protect what he meant to protect, accomplish what he meant to accomplish, become what he meant to become. All of it gathered into the silver bird in front of him. In the way it opened its wings was the determination to smash through obstacles. In the way it hovered was freedom from restraint. In the starshine in its eyes was longing for a vast world. It was Regulus. Or rather, it was the truest and purest part of him, laid bare. He didn't know what kind of patroness it was. He'd never seen a bird like it, and he couldn't remember any book describing it. But he could feel it, perfectly, unmistakably. It fit him. Orion stood 3 steps away, rigid. He stared at the silver bird as if he couldn't blink. His eyes were wide, his lips parted, and his wand nearly slipped from his hand. The head of the House of Black was usually the definition of control. Right now, his face was nothing but shock and disbelief. Several seconds passed before he found his voice again, and when it came it trembled. Starlight Kite. Regulus turned his head. What? Starlight Kite. Orion repeated it, still staring at the bird. A legendary magical creature. I thought it was extinct, or that it was never real in the first place. He took 2 careful steps forward, drawn in by instinct, then stopped, afraid of startling it. The starlight kite turned its head and looked at him. Those silver-grey eyes were calm. No hostility, but no warmth either. There are only scattered records, Orion said, his voice steadying even as his words sped up. Starlight kites only appear in places where magic is pure. They feed on starlight. They can pass through space itself. When they fly, they don't flap their wings, they let space carry them. Their feathers can dispel dark magic. Their eyes can see through illusions. With every sentence, the sense of familiarity in Regulus deepened. Feeding on starlight, just as he practiced star-guided meditation, drawing on the stars, yearning toward them. Passing through space, just as he studied space magic, trying to understand folding and shifting. Flying without flapping, and what he pursued was exactly that, understanding the rules, moving with them, using them. Dispelling dark magic, the way he believed power itself had no inherent good or evil, only purpose and use. Seeing through illusions, the way he'd always tried to look past surface and into truth, refusing to be fooled by false glory or hollow threats. It wasn't just similar to him. It was him, translated into something animal and elemental. Or perhaps it was his heart, made visible through magic. As Orion spoke, something in Regulus stirred. He wanted to test it. A thought flickered through him. Go over there. The starlight kite reacted as if it had heard him. Its shape blurred, and it vanished. Regulus didn't even feel where it went. The ripple of space was too light, too natural, leaving no trace. In the next instant, it appeared 100 meters away, hovering above the sea. Behind it, the sun continued sinking into the horizon, and the bird's silver outline was clean and unmistakable in the gold. Then it disappeared again. When it returned, it stood at the far end of the cliff on a jutting rock, head tilted down as it watched waves crash below. Regulus's thought shifted. Come back. The starlight kite was instantly in front of him again, as if it had never moved. It lifted its head, meeting Regulus's gaze. There was something in those eyes that felt almost intelligent, depth that went beyond instinct. As if it truly understood him, truly moved with his will. Orion watched, and his breathing turned sharp. He fought to keep his composure, but his fingers trembled slightly, and excitement had flushed his cheeks. This was a man who could sit through a Wiesengamot session under crushing pressure without changing expression. Right now, he looked like a child seeing magic for the first time. Dumbledore. He murmured. Dumbledore's patroness is a phoenix. Regulus looked at him. A phoenix is a legendary magical creature, Orion continued, and there was no hiding the thrill in his voice now. It can be reborn from ash. Its tears can heal. Its song can fill people with courage. Everyone says Dumbledore's phoenix patroness foreshadows greatness. He looked back at Regulus, eyes shining with a brightness Regulus had never seen in him before. A starlight kite, in the legends, it's on the same level as a phoenix, maybe even rarer. At least people have seen phoenixes. Starlight kites exist only in the oldest records. Regulus, you. He couldn't finish, too overwhelmed to push the words out, but the meaning was obvious. Regulus would be great. Not just successful, not just powerful, but the kind of wizard who left a name in magical history. Orion's mind even leapt ahead to ridiculous distance. When Regulus eventually stepped onto the public stage and showed what he could do, should the House of Black Crest be changed? The thought passed like a spark. It was far too early for that. Still, he wanted to see that day. Regulus listened, thoughtful. A starlight kite could pass through space like a phoenix, maybe even better. If legends were true, it had an affinity for space itself. But right now, he had only just managed to conjure a corporeal patroness. He could hold it, communicate with it in the simplest way, and that was all. There were many advanced uses for a patroness. Sending messages. Driving off dementors. Scouting. Assisting in combat. All of it would take time and practice. And if the starlight kite truly had space abilities, maybe it could do things other patronuses couldn't. He could use it to practice space magic. Have it slip through certain barriers to gather information. Make it appear behind an enemy in the middle of a fight. Maybe he could find a chance to speak with Dumbledore. When it came to patronuses, Dumbledore was likely among the very best in the wizarding world. With a Phoenix Patroness, he must have developed all kinds of frighteningly brilliant uses. But Regulus would need the right opening. He wasn't Harry Potter. Professors didn't automatically warm to him. This wasn't the same as asking a professor a simple question after class. He couldn't just walk up and request help. Still, opportunities existed. They always did. Orion drew several slow breaths, forcing himself back into calm. Excitement was one thing. Reality still had to be considered. He stepped closer to Regulus, eyes on the starlight kite hovering nearby, and lowered his voice. This Patroness, you should hide it for 2 years. Regulus looked at him, waiting for the reason, even though he already understood the shape of it. The Patroness charm is truly advanced, and it's undeniably positive white magic, Orion explained. If you show it now, it might clash with Voldemort's side. They won't say it aloud, but they'll think it. A Black who can cast a Patroness, and not just any Patroness, doesn't feel like someone who belongs with them. Regulus nodded. Anything beautiful set badly against Voldemort. The Death Eaters and Voldemort worshipped power, control, fear. The Patroness charm stood for protection, hope, and the kind of emotion that pushed back darkness. Those ideals were at odds. And for now, Regulus still needed to maneuver under Voldemort's shadow. He couldn't afford to reveal that incompatibility too early. Chapter 67, Welcome to Nocturne Alley. Regulus suddenly thought of Snape. Snape's Patroness had to be something he kept hidden. Otherwise, he never could have used it to guide Harry Potter to the Sword of Gryffindor. That had been for destroying Voldemort's Horcruxes. If Snape's Patroness had been exposed early on, and even one person from the hero side got caught, Snape would have been finished. Orion's tone shifted as he went on. Of course, if you truly need to use it, then you use it. You can't put yourself in danger just to look weak, he added. But there's one thing. If you do cast it, you should hide the unusual parts. He pointed at the starlight kite. Make it look like a normal bird of prey. It's close enough already. Keep the wings a bit tighter. Let the starlight fade. Darken the eyes. An eagle works too. Wisdom and strength. Suits you. Most people won't be able to tell the difference. Regulus focused inward for a moment, testing it, and realized Orion was right. A Patroness's core form was fixed, but details could be adjusted. The intensity of the glow could be controlled. Making the starlight kite resemble a silver-white eagle was entirely doable. I understand. Regulus nodded, serious as he promised it. Orion let out a quiet breath of relief. He trusted his son's judgment. Regulus turned his attention back to the starlight kite, studying the silver bird hovering near him, and another thought slid into place. Maybe he simply wasn't meant to become an animagus. An animagus form often matched a wizard's Patroness, or at least came close. His Patroness was the starlight kite, a legendary magical creature. There was no world where he was turning into that. Which meant that if he ever learned the transformation, he'd either fail, or end up as something else entirely. But once the thought settled, he found he didn't care as much as he expected. Being an animagus was useful, yes, but it wasn't necessary. With a Patroness, a lot of those functions could be replaced. And a Patroness was pure, concentrated positive energy. It didn't come with the risk of animal instinct bleeding into your mind the way an animagus form could. On top of that, the training took a ridiculous amount of time, and the uncertainty was brutal. It depended too much on weather and luck, and if you made one mistake, you could end up back at the beginning. Besides, what was so amazing about turning into an animal anyway? If he really wanted a different body, why wouldn't he just pursue human transfiguration? Animagus training. He could live without it. Regulus flicked his wand gently. The starlight kite scattered into silver motes and vanished, leaving the air faintly warm, like starlight lingering on skin. He held on to what he'd felt today. The quiet ache of watching the sunset from the cliff. The way his magic had flowed, bright and eager, following his emotions. The deep, soul-level resonance when he'd called the Patroness into being. None of it changed his path. He'd still calculate. Still plan carefully. Still treat power as the foundation of everything. But something was different anyway. Magic wasn't only a tool. It was part of him. The world was worth looking at, worth experiencing. And he, too, was a living person. He could be moved. He could yearn. He could feel real joy at beautiful things. That was good. They returned to 12 Grimald Place by Port Kayat. The old teapot lid yanked them through a whirl of color and noise, then dropped them into the entrance hall of the Black townhouse. Kriaker was already waiting, holding hot towels and steaming tea. "Welcome back, master. Welcome back, young master." Orion took a towel and wiped his face, then looked at Regulus. "Tomorrow is the last day. We'll go to Nocturne Alley to collect what's owed. Get to bed early tonight." Regulus nodded and went upstairs to his room. He stood by the window, looking out at London's nightscape. Compared to the raw sweep of the Irish coast, it was almost plain. And yet, what had happened today felt like the first streak of color painted into a world that had always been black, white, and grey. It was only a light brush, but it was enough. The world was big. The world was beautiful. It was worth seeing. And he had time. He had resolve. He would climb high enough to see it all. On the last day of Christmas break, with the holiday warmth reduced to the faintest aftertaste, Orion brought Regulus to the entrance of Nocturne Alley. Unlike the clean brick wall that hid Diagon Alley, the way into Nocturne Alley was wedged between two leaning buildings, as if the city itself wanted to squeeze it shut. The walls were stained a dark brown with grime Regulus didn't want to think about. The air carried a sour blend of rot, mold, and something sharper, chemical enough to burn the throat. Regulus followed his father into the passage, and the light died almost instantly. The walls on either side were slick with damp. He didn't need to touch them to know they'd feel sticky. A few battered oil lamps hung overhead, their flames jumping behind dirty glass, casting a sickly green glow that stretched shadows long and warped. The ground was uneven, littered with puddles of different depths. An oily rainbow film floated on the surface like spilled poison. After 20 steps or so, the corridor opened up, and Nocturne Alley revealed itself. It was a completely different world from Diagon Alley, like stepping from something civilized into something rotting and lawless. Buildings leaned toward each other on both sides, cramped and crooked, their walls crawling with dark moss. Most windows were nailed shut with boards. Behind the few panes of intact glass, heavy black curtains hung, hiding whatever was inside. The alley itself was narrow, barely wide enough for two carriages side by side, and the street was choked with junk. Broken crates. Torn sacks. Rusted metal barrels. Even a few animal skeletons, so picked clean Regulus couldn't tell what they'd once been. There weren't many people, but the ones there kept their heads down. Everyone was wrapped in dark robes, hoods pulled low, moving fast and keeping close to the walls, avoiding eye contact like it was a curse. In a place like this, Regulus's gift for sensing magic sharpened until it felt like a blade. He could feel the magic rolling off the shops and the passers-by. Most of it was murky and chaotic, threaded through with scraps of bad emotion. It was almost absurd. You could read all the descriptions you wanted about illicit trades and dark artifacts, but none of them did this justice. Every brick, every breath of air, every corner felt soaked in disorder and decay. The only rule here was power. The strong spoke. The weak disappeared. If someone died in Nocturne Alley, their body would probably be dragged away immediately and put to use. No one would ask questions. No one would care. Like a fox taking a rabbit in the woods. Just nature. And the truly ridiculous part was that all of this was illegal under British wizarding law. Everyone knew Nocturne Alley was illegal. The Ministry of Magic knew. The Wizengamot knew. Even Muggle families with a magical child probably heard about it through whispered stories. A horrible place beside Diagon Alley. And yet it still existed. It had existed for centuries. It was still here. The Ministry, or rather the upper levels of wizarding society as a whole, acted as if it was simply accepted. They preached the sanctity of law and order, and then left a huge lawless pit right beside the biggest shopping district in the country. The statutes were written in ink. Clear as day. What was allowed? What wasn't? But Nocturne Alley sat here anyway, an open secret, a lie everyone knew was a lie and no one bothered to challenge. A thought flashed through Regulus's mind. This was probably politics. The law's meaning seemed to be nothing more than a declaration, everything here is illegal. And that was all. Declaring was one thing. Enforcing was another. Regulus wasn't naive. Nocturne Alley existed because it had value. Pureblood families needed a place to handle business that couldn't survive the light. Dark wizards needed resources and information. The Ministry needed somewhere to shove the people and objects that were difficult to control. Pack it all into Nocturne Alley, and as long as you didn't look too closely, you could pretend it wasn't your problem, Britain had always been Britain. But none of that really mattered to Regulus. As a wizard, as the heir to the House of Black, he would need Nocturne Alley too. Or rather, everyone needed it. Purebloods did. Half-bloods did. The Ministry did. Even the so-called righteous light wizards probably did, sooner or later. There had to be somewhere for inconvenient things to be dealt with. This was another ecosystem of the wizarding world. The other face of order. Light and darkness were never cleanly separated. Most of the time, they fed into each other, tangled together until you couldn't fully tell where one ended and the other began. Nocturne Alley was Diagon Alley's shadow. Without shadows, light didn't mean anything. In the end, maybe the simplest truth was this: if it exists, there's a reason. Orion stopped, then leaned slightly toward Regulus and spoke in a low voice. While we're here, only look. Don't talk. Don't touch anything. Every object you see could have a curse on it. Every patch of ground you walk over could be trapped. Every person you meet could be carrying malice. His voice stayed calm as he emphasized, Nocturne Alley is the back of order. There's only one rule here. Stay alive. Everything else is nonsense. Regulus nodded. Chapter 68, The Real Wizarding World Bonus. The first shop they entered didn't have a sign. The only thing hanging from the doorframe was a string of dried bats. Where the bats' eyes should have been, someone had set glowing red gemstones. In the dim light, they looked like bloodshot eyeballs. It was darker inside than it was outside. Most of the items on the shelves were nothing but vague shapes, shadows of bottles and jars. Behind the counter stood a wizard so thin he looked like a skeleton. His eyes were sunken, his skin chalk white, and his fingers were long and sharp, like a bird's talons. When he saw Orion, he pulled his mouth into a grin, showing teeth stained yellow and black. Mr. Black, the man rasped, his voice like sandpaper on wood. This month's goods are ready. Same arrangement as always. He dragged a black leather case up from beneath the counter and cracked it open. Regulus caught a glimpse inside. Dozens of glass jars were stacked neatly, each one holding something pickled in cloudy liquid. Eyes, hearts, fingers. And in one jar, an entire fetal body, curled in on itself. Its skin was so pale it was almost transparent, veins visible beneath it like thin blue threads. Orion didn't touch the case. He simply handed over a cloth pouch heavy with galleons. The wizard took it, weighed it in his hand, then nodded in satisfaction. Tell me ahead of time if you need anything next time, the man said as he shut the case again. Supplies tight lately. The werewolves are causing trouble, and the Ministry of Magic is cracking down. Noted, Orion replied, curt and flat, then turned and left. Regulus followed, watching everything without a change in expression. The second shop sold dark artifacts. A few items were displayed in the window like trophies. A wand carved from human bone, the shaft covered in dense curse runes. A mirror that reflected the deepest fear in a person's heart, its frame pieced together from baby skulls. And a set of ritual daggers, dried blood still clinging to the blades, the handles set with pain-filled memories that had been torn out of someone and preserved. The owner was a witch in black robes. A pure white mask covered her face, with only 2 holes for eyes. Inside those openings, something seemed to burn, like pale ghost fire. When she spotted Orion, she lifted a gloved hand and pointed toward a pile in the corner draped in black cloth. Orion walked over, lifted one edge, glanced beneath it, then nodded. He handed her another pouch of galleons. The third shop was even more hidden, tucked at the end of a dead-end alley. There was no sign here either. Only a twisted symbol painted on the wall in blood. Orion stopped in front of it and traced an inverted pattern through the air with his wand. Only then did the door slide open without a sound. Inside was a cramped room. Chains and manacles hung across the walls. A creature that was half human and half beast was curled in the corner. It might have been some kind of human hybrid. It might have been the result of a failed transfiguration. Either way, it felt wrong to look at it. When it saw them enter, it let out a low, threatening growl, but the chains kept it from moving far. A hunched old wizard came out from the back, carrying a thick ledger. Mr. Black. This month's accounts. His voice was hoarse and rough. There was a problem with the smuggling route. 2 shipments got seized by Aurors. The loss has to be included. Orion took the ledger and flipped through it, a frown tightening his brow. Why were they seized? Someone inside talked, the old wizard spat. We handled it. But the goods aren't coming back. Don't let it happen again. Orion signed the page and handed the ledger back. If it does, you cover the losses yourselves. As they left, Regulus noticed the half-beast creature staring at him. There was hatred in its eyes. Pain too. And beneath it all, something that looked uncomfortably like desperate pleading. Regulus looked away and followed his father out. Shop after shop, Regulus saw things he'd only ever read about in the restricted section. Instruments designed to extract souls. Candles rendered from infant fat. Skin and fur flayed from living magical creatures, still twitching as if it hadn't accepted it was no longer attached to anything. Crystal orbs that held other people's pain like captured smoke. Records of experiments and results that broke every basic boundary of ethics without even pretending to care. And the people running the Black family's interests in Nocturne Alley didn't look like respectable businessmen in any version of reality. The skeletal wizard from the first shop reeked of death. His knuckles carried corrosive scars, the kind you got from years of handling embalming potions. The masked witch in the second shop had magic that felt chaotic and warped, like multiple types of dark magic had been forced together until they stopped fitting properly. The hunched old wizard in the third shop had cloudy yellow eyes, pupils thin like a snake's. When he looked at someone, it felt like he was pricing them. Regulus understood it easily. His father hadn't brought him here just to inspect family holdings. Orion wanted him to see the real wizarding world. Beyond Hogwarts classrooms and the tidy storefronts of Diagon Alley, there was this. Everything hidden behind the light. Cruel, dark, bloody, chaotic. He wanted Regulus to know that wizarding society wasn't only Quidditch and banquets. It was smuggling routes. Dark wizards. Werewolves. Illegal experiments. Human trafficking. Organ trading. All of it existed outside polite society's official story, but it was still real. Some areas were even harder to define, where light and dark bled together, where legal and illegal blurred until the line stopped making sense. A shop in Diagon Alley might sell goods with a questionable origin. A dark wizard in Nocturne Alley might have protection inside the Ministry of Magic. Regulus wasn't a real child anymore, not in the way it mattered. He understood how societies functioned. The Muggle world had slums, black markets, and underground deals. The wizarding world had Nocturne Alley. It was the same thing in different robes. Even if he'd never personally seen this side of wizarding Britain before, the logic was familiar. Demand created supply. Prohibitions created black markets. Laws created loopholes. So he stayed calm. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't afraid. He didn't feel moral nausea. He simply watched, carefully, like he was studying an unfamiliar ecosystem. Orion watched him right back. From the moment they'd stepped into Nocturne Alley, Orion had been tracking every shift in Regulus's expression. The organs floating in jars. The human bone wand and the baby skull mirror. The chained creature in the corner. Regulus hadn't reacted to any of it. He showed no discomfort, no disgust. He only looked. Orion felt a quiet sense of relief, followed immediately by something more complicated. Of course he wanted his son to be resilient, unshaken by the outside world. In a place like Nocturne Alley, even a moment of weakness or hesitation could turn into a fatal opening. Regulus's performance was flawless, calm, rational and focused. Exactly what the heir to the House of Black was supposed to be. And yet, watching an 11-year-old face this level of darkness without flinching still made something twist in Orion's chest. An 11-year-old should still have naive fantasies about the world. They should still believe good and evil were cleanly separated, that justice always won in the end. But Regulus had never been that child. Not even when he was very small. He saw too clearly. He thought too deeply. He'd understood early that the world was complicated, and reality was cruel. It made Orion think of yesterday's Patronus. A legendary creature, a symbol of freedom, exploration, breaking through every boundary. It represented the brightest, most hopeful desires buried in Regulus's heart. And at the same time, he could walk through Nocturne Alley's filth and horror without changing expression, passing jars of organs and artifacts carved from human bone as if they were just objects on a shelf. Light and darkness, living in the same child. Orion didn't know if that was good or bad. But he was certain of one thing. Regulus would become a very, very special wizard. Special enough to surpass every black ancestor before him. Special enough to become great. Orion's evaluation of his son climbed again. Excellent no longer felt like a strong enough word. By the time they stepped out of the seventh shop, Regulus sensed something was wrong. The alley was still the same alley. But there were extra eyes in the air now, fixed on them with open malice. Those gazes came from different directions, sweeping over him and Orion again and again. Regulus didn't turn his head right away. He kept his pace normal, his posture composed, staying half a step behind his father. He let his magic sense spread outward, and it didn't take long before he pinned down several positions. 10 meters ahead on the left, in a corner piled with abandoned wooden crates, 2 sources of magic were hiding there. Weak, murky. They'd used a disillusionment charm, but the casting was sloppy. In the low light, their outlines were still visible, with distortions along the edges that the naked eye could catch. When they moved, dust shifted under their feet, and faint footprints remained. Farther away, near the mouth of the alley, 2 more figures stood under the shadow of a crooked building's awning. One of them had magic that was wild and unstable, carrying a bestial feral edge. Most likely a werewolf, and very possibly one close to transforming. The other felt colder, sharper, and meaner. 4 people total, clearly working together. 2 tracking close, 2 waiting to support from a distance. A standard ambush setup. Chapter 69, Nocturne Alley, Practical Combat Bonus. Regulus drifted closer to Orion without drawing attention and spoke under his breath. We're being followed. 2 under a disillusionment charm on the left ahead, and 2 at the mouth of the alley. One of them might be a werewolf. Orion didn't slow down, and he didn't turn his head. He only gave the smallest nod. He'd noticed long ago. From the moment they entered this side alley, those stairs had stuck to them like flies. With decades of experience clawing his way through the wizarding world, Orion found this level of tailing almost funny. It was blatant, sloppy, and full of holes. They couldn't even manage the most basic concealment. Bottom feeders. That was Orion's assessment. Most likely the lowest tier of dark wizards in Nocturne Alley, the kind who couldn't land real work and couldn't afford real materials. So they camped in back alleys like this, hoping a lone fat sheep would wander past so they could grab one good score. They probably didn't even recognize who he was. Anyone with half an eye and half a brain would have seen the House of Black crest on his robes, would have recognized the face that showed up often enough in the Wisengamot section of the Daily Prophet, and would have understood that this wasn't someone you picked a fight with. But if they couldn't recognize him, then good. He could make use of that. They finished their stop at the last shop, an underground clinic that trafficked smuggled magical creature organs. The owner was a former St. Mungo's healer who'd been expelled for illegal experiments and had simply continued his research in Nocturne Alley. As the shop's handler walked them to the door, he lowered his voice. There are a few people outside who don't look right. They've tailed you for 3 streets. Want me to take care of them? As he spoke, he casually spun a small knife between his fingers. The blade was thin as a cicada's wing, glinting an eerie blue in the low light. Poisoned, obviously. Orion shook his head. No. Then he looked at Regulus. You handle it. Regulus lifted his eyes, waiting for the rest. It's a rare chance for real combat, Orion said, as calmly as if he were assigning homework. You don't always get idiots like this. Even in Nocturne Alley, anyone with a brain knows better than to mistake the head of the House of Black. Since they did, it's perfect for practice. He added, watch your limits. Don't make too much noise. No one cares down here, but Aurors from the Ministry of Magic do patrol sometimes. If they see you, it's trouble. Regulus nodded. Truthfully, he'd wanted to try for a while. When he sparred with Orion, he always held something back. It wasn't that he feared hurting his father. With Orion's level, Regulus probably couldn't, even if he tried. It was that some techniques were simply ugly. Not things you used in a father and son practice match. The sort of spells he'd learned from the restricted section that leaned toward torment and control. The transfiguration applications that came from understanding matter too well, sharp enough to feel poisonous. On garbage like this in Nocturne Alley, though? Perfect. The moment they stepped out of the shop, the 4 stalkers tightened up. The 2 under the disillusionment charm shrank deeper into shadow. Farther off, the werewolf at the alley mouth let out a low, uneasy whine, and the other, colder presence curled fingers around a wand. Regulus took a quick sweep of the area. This side alley was remote, even by Nocturne Alley standards. Most of the buildings were abandoned. Windows were nailed shut. Dark moss crawled along the walls. The ground was broken and uneven, holding stagnant, foul water in potholes. There wasn't a single other pedestrian in sight. Only a few rats rummaging through trash. A perfect place for a lesson. Regulus walked forward alone, 10 steps into the open, and stopped in the middle of the alley. He turned to face the corner piled with discarded wooden crates and spoke in an even voice. "Come out. Your disillusionment charm is terrible. There's no point hiding." The two figures in that corner froze. 2 seconds later, the disillusionment charm dropped. 2 male wizards stepped out of the shadows. Their robes were worn and filthy. Black cloth covered their faces, leaving only their eyes visible. They already had wands in hand, tips aimed at Regulus. "Smart kid," rasped the taller one on the left. "Hand over your money and anything valuable, then get lost." The shorter, stockier wizard beside him added, "And your dad's too. All of it." Regulus didn't bother with a reply. He raised his right hand, wand sliding neatly into his palm, and attacked immediately. A spell slammed into the ground at their feet. Conf Ringo. There was no dramatic roar, but the magic bursting from his wand tip was violent. The potholes full of water detonated. Filthy puddles and shattered stone exploded upward like a storm, pelting both wizards. They jerked their arms up on instinct to shield their faces. Regulus shifted half a step to the left, toes barely touching the ground as he glided forward with unnatural lightness. At the same time, his wand cut 3 arcs through the air, and 3 spells shot out almost together, each one taking a different line. The first was a binding spell. Magic condensed into a semi-transparent rope, barbed along its surface. Once it latched on, struggling only drove the hooks deeper, and it would keep drawing blood the entire time. The rope snapped toward the tall wizard. The second was a severing curse. Magic sharpened into a blade thin as paper, the edge vibrating so fast it made a shriek you could barely hear. This wasn't a simple cut. It could slice flesh and disrupt the flow of magic itself, turning wounds into something stubborn and slow to heal. The spinning blade flashed toward the short wizard's wand hand. The third spell was the most subtle. It hit the wall behind them, and the instant it made contact, the stone rippled like disturbed water. Then the entire surface began to melt and shift. The wall smoothed into a mirror sheen, reflecting the two wizards' backs. The tall wizard saw the rope flying at him and dodged backward on instinct, only to slam into the wall that had become a mirror. The moment his body touched it, the surface grabbed him. It swallowed him in, wrapping around him. His struggles only made ripples. He couldn't break free. And in that heartbeat, the barbed rope snapped tight around his left leg. Hooks sank into flesh and began to drink. The tall wizard screamed and tried to lift his wand to cut the rope, but the stocky wizard was already in worse trouble. The severing blade was too fast. He barely managed to raise his wand in defense. The protective charm was only half formed on his lips when the blade swept across his right wrist. A hair-thin red line appeared. Then his entire hand went slack. His wand slipped free and clattered to the ground. Blood beaded along that line in tight, trembling dots. "My hand!" The short wizard shrieked, clutching his wrist, voice cracking with panic. "Ah! Ah!" At the alley mouth, the werewolf and the cold wizard saw their companions crushed in an instant and rushed in. The werewolf ran on all fours, terrifyingly fast, the earlier whine turning into a beast's growl. He couldn't fully transform, but the change had already started. Teeth sharpening. Nails stretching long and black. Eyes flushing with red. The cold wizard circled to the side, wand whipping through the air as he spat along, harsh incantation. A dozen black ice spikes formed in the air, all pointed at Regulus. With a sharp flick, they shot forward together. Regulus didn't even look at them. He snapped his left hand outward and an invisible barrier unfurled in the air. The ice spikes struck it and their paths warped violently, forced aside so they schemed past him and slammed into the wall behind, bursting into black ice blossoms. At the same time, Regulus leveled his wand at the onrushing werewolf. Transfiguration, aimed at the air the creature was breathing. When the werewolf closed to within 10 meters, a faint silver glimmer sparked at Regulus's wand tip. The werewolf threw his head back and sucked in a huge breath, preparing for the final lunge. Lungs expanding, body demanding oxygen. Nothing happened. The air he'd drawn in had lost its purpose, stripped of whatever made it usable. It refused to do anything inside his chest. Oxygen deprivation hit like a hammer. His eyes went wide, blood vessels swelling red. His speed faltered. Limbs started to soften. But a werewolf's resistance was real. Even without a full transformation, the body's toughness remained. Driven by animal instinct, he surged forward anyway, claws already extended, reaching for Regulus's throat. Regulus stood his ground. He drew his left hand across the space in front of him. Clang! A bright, metallic impact rang out. Silver-white light flared in the air before him like a sudden sheet of steel. Out of the 5 black claws, the longest snapped clean off at the base. The other 4 cracked, tips splintering away. Fragments flew backward in thin black streaks and bounced across the stone with sharp little clinks. The werewolf's entire right paw jerked back. A crisp sound of bone breaking followed. He howled and stumbled away, cradling his shattered wrist, thick dark red blood dripping from his fingertips onto the greenish stone, splashing into tiny blooms. The pain, combined with the lack of oxygen, finally broke his balance. He dropped to his knees, hands braced on the ground, mouth open as he tried to breathe. But every gasp still pulled in useless air. The sprint had burned through what little oxygen reserve his body had left. His muscles began to spasm uncontrollably. His face shifted from flushed red to bluish, then a deep, ugly purple. His eyes bulged, and a wet choking sound crawled out of his throat, the noise of something dying. Chapter 70, Crucio and Avada Kedavra bonus. Regulus watched in silence for a moment, then tapped his wand again, and the werewolf suddenly found he could breathe. He dragged in air greedily, huge gulps that finally filled his lungs. Oxygen slid back into his blood, and the dizzy haze in his head began to ease. He lay there like a drowning man hauled out of the water, gasping wildly. Every inhale went as deep as he could force it, every exhale trembling with the shock of survival. He didn't notice what was happening inside him. The air he'd taken in, after the exchange was done and the carbon dioxide pushed out, left residue in his alveoli that began to change. It condensed, gas becoming solid, invisible turning into something real. Tiny crystals formed, sharp-edged and hard, almost like quartz. In essence, they were the same stones that had exploded from the ground earlier, only ground finer, shaped sharper. The first stab of pain hit on his 10th breath. The werewolf jerked and started coughing, trying to hack the foreign matter out, but the crystals had already embedded themselves into the walls of his lungs. Every cough only drove them deeper. It felt like someone had stuffed his chest with broken glass. Every breath tore. Regulus released the transfiguration. The werewolf still coughed, and the fresh air he drew in now behaved normally, but the crystals from before were still lodged inside him, and they would stay there. Unless someone used magic or surgery to remove them. A werewolf in Nocturne Alley couldn't afford that kind of treatment. He lay curled on the ground. Blood began to thread through the saliva he spit up. The pain folded him in on himself, hands clamped to his chest so hard his nails bit into skin. Regulus observed calmly, satisfied. This was what real combat was for. Testing ideas. The cold wizard saw the werewolf go down and his face shifted. He whipped his wand and summoned more than a dozen shadowy tentacles from the ground. They crawled out of the darkness itself, lined with suckers. Inside each sucker were dense rows of tiny teeth. The tentacles lunged from every direction, sealing off every route of escape. They moved with startling speed, and in a blink they were already in front of Regulus. Regulus didn't move. He simply flicked his left hand again, as casually as brushing dust out of the air. Magic surged from him, and his whole body seemed to become a source of light. Silver-white radiance seeped through his skin, gathering in front of him into a barrier that looked soft, almost gentle, but felt absolutely unbreakable. The shadow tentacles struck it and began to hiss as they dissolved. Wherever they touched the silver light, they started to fall apart, solid becoming mist, mist becoming nothing. One after another, all of them vanished within 2 seconds, leaving no trace behind. The cold wizard's eyes went wide. For the first time, real fear cracked his expression. He tried to step back, but his legs might as well have been nailed to the ground. That's impossible. He didn't get to finish. Regulus operat. One moment he was standing in the alley, the next he was right in front of the man. He put his wand away. Then he lifted his right hand, extending his index finger. A single point of glaring crimson light gathered at his fingertip, painfully bright in the dim alley. Crucio. Regulus was not about to cast it with his own wand on a living person. Not yet. He touched the man's forehead lightly. The crimson light sank in, slipping through skin, through bone, straight into the deepest part of the brain. The cold wizard went rigid. His eyes opened to their absolute limit, as if they might pop out of their sockets. His pupils shrank to pinpoints, the whites turning webbed with red. Every muscle in his face twitched. His mouth pulled crooked. His left eyelid spasmed violently. Under his skin, tiny ripples moved like waves, as if countless insects were crawling between flesh and bone. He tried to scream, but it was like his voice had been locked away. No sound came out, only a thin clicking noise deep in his throat. Saliva spilled from the corner of his mouth and ran down his chin, dripping onto his black robes and spreading into a dark wet stain. Regulus held it for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was enough for the full tide of Crucio to roll through the man. Every nerve shrieked. Every bone felt crushed. Every cell burned. Then Regulus pulled his finger away, and the crimson light vanished. The cold wizard collapsed. His body jerked in uneven spasms, limbs twitching without rhythm, fingers curling into clawed shapes. Spit mixed with snot and tears smeared his face. His eyes lost focus, staring blankly at the lead grey sky, pupils blown wide, mind broken apart. Regulus glanced down at his right hand. There was no mark at all. Smooth skin. Clean nails. That crimson point might as well have been a hallucination. A standard Crucio. The effect was excellent. Crucio was an unforgivable curse, but it wasn't difficult to cast. Harry Potter had managed to use it on Bellatrix in 5th year. Regulus had no reason to be worse than that. He swept his gaze across the alley. 4 enemies. All of them out of the fight. From start to finish, it had taken less than 2 minutes. Regulus stood in the middle of the alley with steady breathing. His robes were neat. Even his hair hadn't come loose. Orion remained by the shop entrance, hands clasped behind his back, watching without a word. From the moment Regulus stepped out alone to the moment all 4 opponents went down, Orion saw every second. He was pleased. Regulus's performance was even better than he'd expected. His spell work was smooth. His choices were flexible. He used the environment well, seized timing perfectly, and his coldness under pressure exceeded Orion's predictions. But Orion didn't relax. His attention stayed locked on the 4 bodies, especially the cold wizard who'd been hit with Crucio. Crucio was agony, but it didn't always completely erase a person's ability to fight. Some wizards went through special training. Some could retaliate while under it. Carelessness got people killed everywhere. Nocturne Alley was worse than most. Regulus stood where he was, looking down at what he'd made of them. The tall wizard was still struggling uselessly, but his movements were growing weaker. The barbed rope had already drained most of his life away. The short wizard clutched his sliced wrist, eyes unfocused, muttering something under his breath. The werewolf knelt on the ground. Every breath came with violent coughing, the spit flecked with blood. The cold wizard lay twitching in fits, eyes turned toward the sky, pupils blown wide. Regulus waited about 10 seconds, then looked back toward the shop entrance. Orion was still standing there, hands behind his back, not coming closer, not speaking, simply watching. Regulus understood immediately. The fight hadn't been the only test. His father wanted to see what he did next. How he handled enemies who were down. How he assessed threat. How he made a decision. That was part of real combat too, and it might have been the more important part. In that case, fine. Regulus lifted his wand again and aimed it at the nearest target, the cold wizard who'd been struck by Crucio. He drew in a breath and spoke the incantation clearly, evenly, without emotion. Avada Kedavra. Green light gathered at the tip of his wand. But at the instant it was about to fire, there was a sharp crack in the air, and Orion appeared beside him. Orion lifted his right hand, caught Regulus's wrist, and pressed down. The green flash shot wide, skimming past the cold wizard's shoulder and slamming into the wall behind. The spot it hit turned instantly ash-grey, then burst apart, stone blowing outward. Orion kept his hand on Regulus's wrist and turned to stare at his son, confusion written across his face, along with shock he couldn't quite hide. Was there something wrong with this boy? The killing curse? Orion didn't care where Regulus had learned it. The family library held plenty. So did other places. What he couldn't understand was the sheer decisiveness. Then he saw Regulus's expression. There was something almost teasing in it, close to amused. A spark in those grey eyes. The faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. Orion froze for a heartbeat. Then he understood. He'd been played. Regulus hadn't intended to kill anyone, especially not with his own wand. The casting posture, the incantation, the green light, all of it had been real, but it was meant for Orion's benefit. For no reason other than entertainment. It was Avada Kedavra. As long as it wasn't aimed at a person, practicing it wasn't that big a deal. Orion released Regulus's wrist. His face returned to something close to blank, but there was a small, unexpected warmth in him. His son had actually joked with him. In 11 years, it was the first time. Regulus was usually too mature, too steady, too unlike a child. Seeing a flicker of mischief, even like this, made Orion think it was good. That isn't how Avada Kedavra is used. Orion kept his voice as calm as he could, giving away very little. I know. Regulus lowered his wand, then paused, and added deliberately, there are records in the family library. Hogwarts's restricted section has it too. If someone wants to learn it, they can. And the curse itself isn't difficult. The hard part is having the will to kill.
Additionally, if you would like to request novels and access my Google Drive where I have 200+ audiobooks, then you can join my Patreon. Link is also provided in the description.